The Defiant, Star Legend Book 6, written and narrated by J.J. Green. Chapter 21. "I have to tell them," said Taylan. Wright heaved a sigh. "No, you don't." It was the quiet shift and they'd just climbed into bed. The issue had been niggling at her all evening as they'd eaten dinner, spent time with Patrin and Kayla, and while Wright had been finishing his report for Yorkson. It had been a bone of contention between them since the first day aboard ship. She'd brought up the subject over and over again, and each time Wright had shot it down, arguing there was no point now no one could change anything, that she would be destabilizing morale, already fragile here in the depths of interstellar space. "But why are we on this mission?" she asked. Wright thumped his pillow to fluff it up and replied wearily, "To challenge the aliens who have been—" "No! Why are we really on this mission?" He lay down and put his hands, fingers linked, behind his head. "There's another reason." "Isn't it to stand up for what we believe in?" "That too. Should I turn out the light?" "In a minute. What do we believe in? What are supposed to be the Alliance's core values?" "Taylan, it's been a long day. Can we talk about this tomorrow?" He looked tired. From what he'd said, every officer-level task on the ship seemed to fall to him now he'd been promoted. And Wright loved his sleep. Many a time she'd marvelled at how deeply he slept and how peaceful he looked when not troubled by nightmares. She felt bad keeping him awake, but she needed to follow through with this train of thought. She had hit the essence of the problem. He had to understand her reasoning for what she was going to do. "What are the Alliance's core values?" she repeated. "To maintain and further human civilization and progress, to uphold basic human rights, to promote justice, truth, liberty." "That's right, truth." He groaned and covered his face with a hand. "I walked right into it, didn't I?" "How can the Alliance expect to succeed in this mission if it isn't even upholding the values it supposedly stands by?" "The mission's success isn't going to be down to what its members know or don't know. If you go through with this, you'll be causing more harm than good. I can tell you that as a fact." "Can you? A fact? Right, no one knows what's going to help or hinder us here. We've been picked according to some weird scientific phenomenon no one really understands, and we're travelling aboard a ship that's part tough jellyfish, off to do who knows what. There are no facts here." He turned onto his side and propped himself up on his elbow. "You're making up justifications for something you've already decided to do. You're determined to tell them. That's what this is about." His words hit home. "Maybe," she conceded. "Since what happened at the Crusader Festival on Unis Morn, I feel like I owe them. They're good people, and I betrayed them." "From what you've told me, you did what you felt was right. Mark's involvement and what happened to him wasn't your fault, and you put it right the first chance you had." She bit her lip. She'd often told herself the same kind of things, but it didn't take away the guilt. "Can we please turn out the light?" Wright asked. She gave the command and darkness fell in their little cabin. A muscular arm snaked out and pulled her close. Soft lips kissed her neck. She chuckled. "I thought we were going to sleep." "In a little while." The following morning she quickly dressed and left before Wright woke up. She didn't want to give him a chance to change her mind. It was still early in the active shift and the passageways were empty. She'd looked up the cabin where the brothers from West BI bunked weeks ago, and she remembered it off the top of her head. When she pressed the door's chime, it slid open instantly, without anyone asking who had come knocking. The scene in the little space was a bustle of activity. The men had been given a 4-bunk cabin, though only 3 of them slept here. Like her and Wright, Seren and Mark had been allotted married quarters. Malir, Madog and Medwin were up and finishing their preparations to leave. Mark was already fully dressed. He stood on the other side of the doorway, open-mouthed. You could look happier to see me, she joked. Sorry, Taylan, he replied, breaking from his expression of surprise. I was expecting Seren. She said she'd be here in a minute. Come in. Is everything okay? It's a little early for visitors. Hang on, growled Medwin. Don't let her in. She's here to make trouble as always. Taylan cringed. What she was about to tell the brothers would make trouble. Maybe Wright was correct and she should keep her mouth shut. Mailir said heavily, It's all right. That was a long time ago. Indeed it was. Grey streaks ran through the eldest brother's hair and beard, and his siblings all showed signs of the decade that had passed since the days of the BI resistance. Medwin muttered something unintelligible, but, as always, conceded to Mailir. Madog remained silent, studying her from under frowning brows. It won't take long, she said. There's something I felt you deserved to know, and I've come here to tell you. The door chimes sounded. There's Seren, said Mark. The pretty woman stepped into the cabin and immediately paused as she took in the serious faces. What's wrong? Has someone died? Not yet, said Medwin. But Taylan's here, so no doubt it won't be long. She clenched her jaw. If it hadn't been for me, you could have burned innocent children alive. That's not fair, said Mark. Mailir said, Mark, be quiet. Sowing discord already, Medwin commented. Well done. Shut up, Mailir said through his teeth. Let her speak and get whatever it is that's bothering her off her chest. Then she can go. It pained her deeply that these people she shared so much with, a language, culture, heritage, and, at one point, a deep comradeship, could not be her friends. But what was done was done. An expectant silence had fallen as 5 pairs of eyes regarded her. She took a breath. At that first meeting after we'd boarded ship, when Yorkson announced that the Skein mappers had discovered signs of the aliens' return to Earth, you, Mailir, said that the Alliance should have told us before we embarked on the mission. That's right, he said. I did. And Yorkson replied that they didn't find out in time. Yes. Mailir was peering at her intently. Had he guessed what she was about to say? She paused, feeling the weight of responsibility for what she was about to tell them and all the consequences she might unleash. It isn't true. He lied. I knew it, Medwin yelled, slamming a fist into the bunk frame. Are you sure? Madog asked. Or are you just stirring up shit again? Madog's right, said Mailir. That's a serious allegation to make. Why should we believe you? Wait. Medwin got up close and thrust his face into hers. You're trying to weasel your way in with us again, aren't you? Pretending you're on our side, telling us lies to make us think you're our friend. For Star's sake, said Mark, pulling him back. Knock it off! What makes you think Taylan would want to be your friend, you pock-marked middle-aged moron? Get your hands off me, little brother. Everyone knows you always had a thing for her. Sorry, Seren, but it's true. The young woman's gaze was travelling from brother to brother with a look of bewilderment. You're all mad, except for Mark. What kind of family have I married into? You're forgetting Taylan and I already know each other. We met in the resistance days. I didn't see much of her, but I saw enough to know she isn't a troublemaker. She's brave, loyal and honest. If you want to find out the cause of the strife between you, look to yourselves. Please, Taylan said. Just hear me out. I'll explain how I know Yorkson was lying, and then you can judge for yourselves. I'm only here because my knowledge of the truth has been eating away at me for weeks. We've had our differences. Medwin gave a snort of derision. You can say that again. Ignoring him, she continued, but I respect you guys, all of you, even if I don't get it back. Maybe I don't deserve it. She went on to tell them about her and Wright's visit to the Institute of Skein Studies and how Colburn had spoken to Wright separately. After that, he was very insistent that I and my kids joined the mission. But he didn't know how long you would be gone, said Seren. He didn't want to leave you behind. It was that too, Taylan admitted. But I've asked him since if he found out about the aliens' return that day, and he hasn't denied it. He hasn't confirmed it either? Asked Mark. I know him, said Taylan. If I was wrong, he would tell me. Our visit to the Institute was months before the mission departure date. They knew. The Alliance knew. And they didn't tell you, not until you were safely aboard ship and there was no going back. Chapter 22. In the months that had passed since the Defiant had departed Mars' orbit, Carla Orr's anger had built to screaming pitch. She had complained, sent in requests for a hearing, and regularly demanded to speak to Yorkson, but she'd been completely ignored. The glaringly obvious injustice of her position was apparently only clear to her. No matter how much she objected, the Alliance insisted on treating her like a common criminal. Her, the Dweir. Even Perrin didn't share her opinion on their outrageous treatment, despite the fact that he had to be suffering too. She had laid it out to him countless times. It's entirely normal and expected that we should try to resume control. We can't be blamed for it. The BA has stripped us of all our rights and dignity. Who wouldn't want to do something about it? The Alliance has to understand we couldn't take their insults lying down. A reasonable period of punishment is to be expected, but to incarcerate us both for the whole voyage, there and back, is outrageous. Animals are treated better than this. The few times Perrin voiced a reply to her comments, it was always along the lines of separating himself from inclusion in her actions. I hate it when you say we. It was you who did it all, Mother. You dragged me into your schemes, and now I'm paying the price. The worst thing about the fury coursing through her veins was it had no outlet. In her previous life, when the Crusade dominated all of Europe and was working its way across the globe, in times of great stress, she would go to a high tower facing the sea and whip the tension from her body. As the blood flowed, her feelings would ease. Here, in this loathsome cabin, there was nothing she could use for a similar relief. Everything with which she might harm herself had been removed, and cameras watched them constantly. It was unbearable. Perrin passed the time by painting. Her son, painting, like some snivelling, weak-willed, lackluster underdog. He'd been working on his latest picture for days. An abstract painting. Swirls of deep purple, grey and black swept across the surface. What did it mean? He would never explain his work, only saying it was up to the observer to take whatever they wanted from it. Sometimes she doubted she understood him at all. Despite sensing the act was desperate and futile, she scribbled a note on a piece of paper. Writing something down was the only way to avoid the Alliance's scrutiny. The watchers would see that she'd written, but not what she wrote, and after Perrin had read her words, she could destroy the evidence. She poked his back. Sighing, he put down his brush and turned. Mother, He spotted what was in her hand. Ugh, not again. Read it, she hissed. Just read it. There's no point. I am your mother and the Dweir. His expression twisted in disgust, but he took the proffered paper. She knew the message off by heart now. She'd made the proposal several times. Tell the guard you need psychiatric help, that you're going crazy trapped in here day after day. Tell her you're having suicidal thoughts. That's all you need to do. I can do the rest. The ploy had worked once. On the Dauntless, she'd managed to fool the idiot psychiatrist and secure some small freedoms. But the same trick wouldn't work for her again, not even on the stupid Alliance admiral. But he might believe Perrin. She suspected the Alliance trusted him more. He'd been under their sway for years in her absence. They were probably only keeping him imprisoned with her as a precaution, not because they believed he was her conspirator in the events at Mars Station. They didn't want her to have any influence on anyone outside her place of incarceration, and being her son made Perrin vulnerable. He had given her note a cursory glance. Now he was looking at her, exasperation written over his features. "How many times do I have to tell you? I refuse to go along with your little ruses. I won't do it, Mother. I simply won't do it. And not only that." He folded the paper neatly in half, turned, and marched toward the other side of the cabin. Realizing where he was headed, she exclaimed, "No, Perrin, no, don't do that." She raced to his side and attempted to snatch the paper out of his hand. He simply lifted it up into the air. He was a lanky young man and easily moved the note out of her reach. She thought of another tactic. She darted ahead of him. When she reached the garbage chute, she about-faced and covered it with her back, spreading her arms out. "If you put it in there, they'll collect it and read it. They'll know what I was trying to do." "Mother, they already know what you're trying to do. You demonstrated your intentions very effectively on Mars. I could hold it up to one of the cameras. Should I do that instead?" "You wouldn't." "Wouldn't I?" She covered her face with her hands. "Don't you care anything about me? You and I are all we have in the world. We should care for each other. Why won't you do this tiny thing for me?" "Because we're in enough trouble as it is. Every time you pull a stunt like you did on Mars and get caught, I'm tarred with the same brush. It isn't fair. I just want to live a normal life. I don't want to belong to a weird cult." She threw down her hands and clenched them into fists, hissing, "The Crusade is not a weird cult." Marching away from the chute, she continued, "How I rue the day I released Morgan from her underground prison. That was the point at which everything began to go wrong. She took over my life, took my son from me, ruined everything. No, you ruined everything. You ruined everything for me. You made me a nasty brat. You were hardly ever there, leaving me to be brought up by servants. And when you were there, you spoiled me, puffing me up with ideas of my own importance. It took a long time for me to understand it, but years of living a normal life made it clear in the end. You were a terrible parent, and I'm still suffering the consequences. Besides, your downfall had nothing to do with Morgan. It was Arthur's return that turned the tide for the Alliance." His ingratitude and criticism washed over her like burning oil. She could only splutter, "That's what they want you to believe. You shouldn't listen to the propaganda. I was there. I know what happened. You were only a child, and Morgan had turned you against me by then. I liked her. She paid more attention to me than you ever did. How dare you?" Carla whipped around and raised a hand to slap Perrin's face, but he caught her forearm in midair. His grip was surprisingly powerful. He squeezed her muscle and forced her arm down. Leaning in, he whispered, "Don't even think about it, Mother. I am not a child anymore, and I won't put up with your bullying, nor will I take part in your ridiculous plans. Your time is over. You're a has-been, a nothing." He put his lips close to her ear and hissed, "You're pathetic." He let go of her arm and she collapsed to the deck. Against her will, sobs erupted from her throat. She sprawled on her front, despair, shame, and humiliation consuming her. Chapter 23. Yorkson had called a meeting. Wright didn't know exactly why. Colburn hadn't told him anything, and the reason for the meeting was vague, to address issues arising aboard the ship. The notice given was short, only an hour and a half, and attendance was mandatory for everyone except for a skeleton crew. He could see Taylan, Patrin and Kayla in the crowded space, but the seats adjoining them were already occupied. He found one of the few empty ones and sat down. When the meeting started, it wasn't Yorkson who walked to the front, it was Dr. Kim, while the Admiral quietly took up a position behind her. Wright knew the psychiatrist well from his previous dealings with her aboard the Dauntless. For this trip, she'd left him alone so far. "Thank you all for coming," the doctor said. "I apologize for dragging you away from your activities, but I have an announcement that I felt was more appropriate to make face-to-face rather than as an impersonal comm." She paused and then said gravely, "It is with great sadness I have to inform you that Lance Corporal Buchanan died by his own hand today." She waited as murmurs of shock and sadness ran through the audience. Wright cursed and put his head in his hands. He knew the man, of course, though not well. Buchanan had worked on the bridge, relaying and interpreting sensor data. He had always completed his duties skillfully and efficiently, never giving the slightest trouble to his superior officers. Wright couldn't remember noticing any signs of distress in him. He had hidden his feelings well. "Naturally," the doctor said, "this is devastating news, the last thing any of us wants to hear. For anyone who wishes to pay their last respects, his funeral will take place tomorrow at 1200 hours at Airlock B. His family have been informed." Yet again she paused, surveying the assemblage. This event is not only appalling for Buchanan's friends and associates, it also has wide-ranging implications for the rest of the ship's personnel. His superior officers may feel they failed him, and that is a burden I and the rest of the psychiatric team carry too, irrationally. He had not approached any of us regarding his mental state. Unfortunately, failure to seek treatment is a common symptom of depression and anxiety, as well as, if I may say, the military mindset. Admitting you may be suffering from mental ill health while in military service is sometimes seen as weak and shameful, whereas in fact it is nothing of the kind. She sighed and said, "I digress. Some of you here are veterans of the voyage of the Dauntless and are aware of the similar problems we experienced on that mission. Buchanan's death must be a wake-up call to us all. According to updates we've received from Skein mappers on Earth, we are still some distance from our destination. We must do all we can to prevent further events. I would ask that if you feel you or someone you know may need help, to please, please, please contact the psychiatric team. Whatever the hour, there will always be someone available. Thank you." She stepped away from the central position and Yorkson took her place. "Thank you, Dr. Kim. Needless to say, I will be personally expressing my deepest sorrow and sympathies to Lance Corporal Buchanan's parents. Now, as our mission continues, it is beholden upon all of us to do everything we can to maintain morale and a positive outlook. Therefore, as well as taking away the sad news from this gathering today, I would ask you to think of suggestions to improve the mood aboard ship. We already have the habitat. I encourage you to visit it whenever you can. Green spaces are good for mental health. What else can we do? We need distractions and activities to strengthen our community." A hand went up. "Permission to speak, sir." It was an officer cadet, probably the youngest Marine on board, not much older than Patrin. "Granted." The Marine stood and addressed the audience. Anyone who likes playing board games is welcome to join the Xiangqi tournament. It's a tough game, but a lot of fun. I'm sure Abacha won't mind people joining late." "Not at all," Abacha said. "I'm happy to explain the rules to newbies." "At length," drawled an anonymous voice, drawing a ripple of gentle laughter that eased the tense, melancholic mood. Arthur also rose to his feet. The king did not seek Yorkson's permission to speak. "Taylan Ellis and I are well versed in ancient fighting arts. We are happy to provide demonstrations and practice sessions." Taylan turned and locked gazes with Wright, her expression saying everything about Arthur blithely volunteering her without consultation. "That is an excellent idea, Your Majesty," said Yorkson. "I am sure there are many among our military and civilian divisions who would be interested in taking up your offer." As Arthur sat down, Maelier stood up. What would his suggestion be? Perhaps he might teach his native language. If so, Wright considered attending lessons. He was interested to learn, but Taylan always put him off, telling him she had enough to do already. But the man from West BI had a face full of thunder. "Well, isn't all this lovely? A man kills himself and the Alliance seizes the chance to create a bit of community feeling." Yorkson said, "I am not sure what your point is, but this isn't the time or place. It's exactly the time and place. I've been waiting until most of us were gathered together again to say my piece." "Shit, she's told them." For months, Taylan had been threatening to spill the beans to her countrymen. She had gone and done it. Maelier levelled a pointed finger at Yorkson. "You, sir, are a liar." The Admiral's eyes flicked to the two entrances to the auditorium, where, in a more formal situation, guards would stand. There were no guards. Maelier continued, speaking generally to those seated around him. "When we boarded this ship, we all attended a meeting similar to this, where we were informed that aliens who are the targets of this mission had already returned to Earth. They were walking among us again, playing their games with human lives. We were told this information was new, that it had arrived too recently to tell the mission members and let them make their own decisions about whether to leave their loved ones behind. That was a lie." He swept his gaze back to Yorkson. "Wasn't it?" The Admiral didn't answer. Dr. Kim stepped forward. "Whatever your complaint is, there are channels through which you can make it. Hijacking this meeting for your own purposes is inappropriate, especially considering the reason we're here in the first place." "You think my point isn't relevant to that young man's death?" "Doctor, it has everything to do with it. While we've been gone, years have passed on Earth. I don't know who among you still watches the news reports. I know I find it hard to myself. It makes me feel like everything's moved on without me. But I do watch them. Things have been happening back home that worry me. They make me fear for the future of everyone I care about. If I'd known I would be in this position, I would never have left. But I had my decision taken from me by that man. And if that isn't a morale killer, I don't know what is. So enjoy your little games and play fighting. I and my brothers will have no part of it. From now on, we won't be participating in this mission, because we are not here of our free will. Until we return to Earth, we will be unwilling passengers on this ship, just waiting to disembark." He pushed past the people sitting in his row, moving toward the aisle. At this signal, Medwin, Madog, and Mark also rose. Maelier marched to the exit, and his brothers followed, though Mark gave Taylan an apologetic glance. When the door had slid closed behind them, Yorkson spoke into the shocked silence. "I apologize for that man's outburst. I have absolutely no idea what he was talking about. It may be he's in the throes of a mental health crisis." He asked Kim, "Perhaps you or someone from your team could speak to him?" "Certainly, Admiral." Chapter 24. Brigadier Colburn stared at Wright for so long without saying anything, he began to grow uncomfortable. He knew why she wanted to speak to him. He wished she would get it over with. Things had been going so well, too, everything considered. Taylan and he were getting along great. The kids were still enjoying the voyage and hadn't yet realised how monotonous and boring space travel really was. Buchanan's death was a tragedy, but, generally, morale seemed better this time compared to the Dauntless. For one thing, there were no pale ghosts appearing at random. That always helped. "Is this mission a joke to you, Lieutenant Colonel?" "I'm sorry, Ma'am." He squirmed in his seat, facing her across her desk. Despite all the years he'd known her, or maybe because he knew her so well, Colburn had a knack for making him feel like a naughty schoolboy. "I'll put it more simply," Colburn said icily, rising from her seat. "Do you think we're all here for fun? Is this voyage a jaunt, a jolly jape, a light-hearted prank to tickle the fancy of the aliens plaguing humanity?" As she'd spoken, she leaned a little farther over her desk with each example she gave. He gritted his teeth. His superior officer's anger might be justified, but he was no grunt. He was a Royal Marine officer. "Ma'am, if you want to talk about Melior's outburst, I would appreciate it if you would get to the point." Glaring at him, she sat down. "I have to say, ever since you became involved with that woman, your standards have slipped." "I don't understand." "There's no nice way to put this. Your behaviour and attitude have become impaired." "No," he said forcefully. "What I don't understand is how you dare refer to my wife as that woman." She locked gazes with him. He stared back, unblinking. She broke eye contact. "You're correct. I have requested a meeting with you in order to discuss the breach of security that resulted in today's debacle." Knitting her fingers, she rested her elbows on the desktop. "Only a very few Royal Marine officers were made aware of the Skein mapper's findings and the increase in urgency for the mission. Neither Yorkson nor I can think of a reason any of those officers would have divulged the information to civilians on this ship. Such an action would be extremely foolish. It would incite discontent and dissent, as we saw happen today. Not only would it be foolish, it would be a direct contravention of orders." She paused. When he didn't speak, she asked, "Do you have anything to say?" "Do you mean in terms of, if I confess my lapse, I won't face a court-martial?" "Something like that, perhaps. We'll have to see. Right, it's clear the breach must have come from you. Taylan Ellis, your wife, is friends with those men from West BI. They were in the Resistance together. Even if we didn't have their connection through the Skein, it's all documented. There's only one conclusion to draw. You told Ellis, and Ellis told Melior. If you admit it, things might go marginally easier for you when we return to Earth." "Might go marginally easier? Wow, I must take up that offer." "Sarcasm won't help you." Colburn sighed and passed a hand over her eyes. "What happened to you? You used to be a fine officer. When we served on the Dauntless, I really thought you had turned a corner. I said to myself, at last, the old Wright is back again. Then Ellis returns to the scene and you fall apart. She's just a woman. I don't understand why she has such a profound influence over you." "Clearly." He actually felt sorry for Colburn. She was wedded to the Alliance. She was a spouse of military service. She really didn't understand human relationships. "Brigadier, I can see how you might find it difficult to believe, but I didn't tell Taylan or Melior that we knew about the aliens' return well before the start of the mission." "You're right. I do find that difficult to believe." "If I can explain." She gave a cautious nod. He related the basics about how the meeting where she'd told him the Alliance suspected the aliens were back had taken place during Taylan and her family's visit to the Institute, and how Taylan had gone on to put two and two together. "She isn't stupid, Brigadier. She might not act like it sometimes, but she's very smart. When she asked me about what you'd told me that day, I couldn't deny it. I can't and I won't lie to her. I know you don't get it, but she means everything to me. My relationship with her is more important than my service. It's more important than anything." Colburn's look was full of pity. "You poor deluded man. I can see she's thrown a spell over you more powerful than any of Carla Orr's prestidigitations." "Deluded or not, I didn't contravene any orders, and I wasn't responsible for a security breach. It's all an unfortunate coincidence of events." "If I believe you, it absolutely is not." "Why?" "Even if you didn't tell Mailer, Ellis did. She deliberately passed on sensitive intelligence, entirely heedless of the consequences." "And what are you going to charge her with? She isn't a Royal Marine." "She signed a security contract." "So did Mailer and his brothers. She passed information to people at the same security clearance level as her. And it wasn't even information. It was a guess that happened to be right." "Nevertheless, her actions have resulted in anger, disruption and turmoil aboard this ship at a crucial point in our mission. You remember what happened on the Dauntless. Do you want to see a repeat?" Wright leaned against his seat back and folded his hands in his lap. "Is all this really Taylan's fault? Isn't it the Alliance's?" "How so?" "We withheld crucial information from the mission members. I'm sorry, Brigadier, but I happen to think Mailer's anger is justified. He and all the other civilians should have been informed about the mapper's findings. The Alliance behaved badly, and now we're suffering the results." Colburn tutted and shook her head. "I don't know what's got into you, Wright. I really don't." Later, when he returned to his cabin, Taylan greeted him at the door with a hug. "Was it bad? Did she tear strips off you? Have you been demoted?" "It was fine," he replied, hugging her back. "Don't worry about it." Chapter 25. Teaching ancient fighting techniques turned out to be more enjoyable than Taylan had anticipated. Kevin had taken up Arthur's offer, and so had a man Wright served with on the Resolute, Captain Ford. It was nice to see more of Kevin, and she enjoyed listening to the two men's accents. It reminded her of her time in Australia and finally finding Patrin and Kayla. Kevin was one of the few civilians who attended the sessions. Most of the participants were military, including, to her delight, a Batcher. She hadn't managed to spend much time with him yet. She missed their late-night Shang-Chi sessions, even though she'd lost every match, and the friendship of her bunkmate during a tough time in her life. She had been self-sabotaging then, punishing herself for abandoning her search for her kids. The training sessions were so popular she'd drafted in Patrin to help. He was as good as her at most of the techniques now, if not better in some things, and he had height and weight to use to his advantage, which he did to great effect. Teaching him as he grew up had been a bittersweet process, reminding her of Dad and how he must have felt when passing on his skills to her. At the time, she hadn't been aware of the pride and joy you experienced when your kid learned something new or improved their expertise. She and Arthur kept the format simple. They began each session with a short demonstration, followed by an explanation of what they'd done and why. Sometimes they would break down moves into their component parts and slowly replay them step by step. Then the group would split into pairs to practice, and Taylan and Arthur would observe and give tips and advice. Finally, the bravest pairs would take turns to step up to the front and spar. It was a lot of fun, and the participants seemed to enjoy themselves too. Patrin turned 18 on a training day, and Taylan arranged a surprise celebratory dinner in the mess. It wouldn't be a typical 18th birthday bash, but there wouldn't be many 18-year-olds who could say their party took place aboard a starship in interstellar space. Kevin and Patrin were the last to spar at the end of the day's session. Kevin had taken to calling Patrin Nipper, which was hilarious considering the boy stood head and shoulders taller than the Australian. He'd taken some persuading to believe that Patrin was the little boy he'd helped to find in the outback. "All right, Nipper," he drawled as they squared up. "Show me what you got." The audience chuckled. "Go easy on him, Kevin," Ford called out. "You don't want to embarrass the kid." Laughter echoed around the gym. Most of those present had fought Patrin or seen him fight. No one was in any doubt about which of the two would be embarrassed. Patrin smiled good-naturedly. He lifted his sword. Kevin did the same and also raised his shield. "Remember, Patrin," said Taylan, lifting her voice over the audience's chatter. "Focus. Don't let anything distract you." Once, long ago it seemed, when she'd been sparring at staves with Arthur, Merlin had clapped loudly and broken her concentration. The result had been a smashed-in nose. She'd been careful to help her son avoid making a similar mistake. Boy and man began to circle, gazes locked. Kevin broke first, darting in to slash at Patrin's knees. The boy batted the blade away with the part of his sword nearest the hilt, the forte, like a man brushing a fly from his face. Kevin drew back, and they circled again. Kevin's best hope against an opponent with a longer reach was to get in close where the reach didn't matter. But sword fighting up close was awkward and clumsy, and Patrin would try to avoid it if he could. Yet as Taylan watched, he didn't really seem to be trying. With his height, weight and skill superiority, he could drive forward and finish Kevin off in a couple of blows. He was kindly allowing the man time to practice and letting him save face. Kevin tried again. He bounded forward and smashed his shield into Patrin's. The force merely made the boy rock a little on his heels. Kevin swiped with his sword, but Patrin had anticipated the blow and deflected it with his guard. Taylan mentally followed through what should happen next. Kevin's left side was open. All Patrin had to do was angle his sword toward Kevin's throat and poke upward, but he didn't. He leaned his shoulder into his shield and forced the Australian backward, creating space between them once more. "It's like a cat playing with a mouse," came a quiet remark. "Painful to watch." Kevin didn't hang around before launching his third attack. He raced at Patrin, clashing shields with him again. This time he tried to stab across his body at Patrin's leg, but again the boy guessed the trajectory of the blade and smoothly turned to the side. He collided with Kevin, unbalancing him. Before he could recover, Patrin hooked his foot behind the older man's ankle, redoubling his downward motion. Then Kevin was on the deck, and the point of Patrin's sword was at his throat. Kevin clambered to his feet and tucked his sword under his shield arm to shake Patrin's hand. "Happy birthday, fella!" The boy's eyes widened, and he looked at Taylan. The time for subterfuge was over. She told him to get changed and come to the mess. Wright joined them for the party, sitting down next to her as the cook and helpers brought the food out. Abacha sat on her other side. Patrin was guided to the head of the table, the guest of honour. He looked embarrassed, but a little embarrassment wouldn't hurt. He would only turn 18 once. The cooks had prepared his favourite foods, including leek pie made from a crop Iolani had been surreptitiously growing for months in a specially cooled section of the habitat. Beer was also served. As Patrin drank his serving, Taylan turned to Wright and asked, "Did you see that?" What?" "This isn't the first time he's drunk beer." Wright shrugged. "What did you expect? How old were you when you had your first drink?" She coloured before replying, "That was different." Wright gave her a sideways hug and then continued to shovel food into his mouth. She asked, "There isn't going to be any hazing, is there? I've heard about what can happen in the military on birthdays." "No way," Wright replied through a mouth of food. "Patrin isn't a Royal Marine, and even if he were, it would be a brave man who would try anything with him." The guests had brought presents, small, simple gifts they'd created, repurposed or printed. T-shirts, a shaving kit, cakes and candies, a comb, a holoscribe. Taylan was grateful. She hadn't managed to find anything to give him. Instead, she'd promised that when they returned to Earth, they would go shopping for something special. Arthur got up from his seat and walked to Patrin's, drawing everyone's attention. Though they were all used to his presence, he remained king of the Britannic Isles. He handed Patrin a gift wrapped in plain paper. When Patrin tore the paper open, gold glinted from within it. A hush settled over the table. Patrin pulled out Arthur's arm talk. His eyes round, he stared at Taylan and then Arthur. "I can't accept this." He tried to force the talk into the king's hands. Arthur gently pushed it back. "You must. You are a warrior now. In my time, I would have made you a knight of my table, and it would have gladdened my heart to have you among their company." Turning to Taylan again, he asked, "Ma'am?" She shrugged. "He's the king. You have to do what he says." His expression a picture of pride and joy. Patrin slipped the talk over his sleeve and up his arm until it clung to his biceps. Arthur clapped him on the shoulder before returning to his seat. Kayla rose to her feet and tapped her glass with a fork until she had everyone's attention. "What's this about?" Wright quietly asked. "I've no idea," replied Taylan. "It isn't in the timetable." What was her daughter going to say? Taylan held her breath. Kayla said, "As no one is giving a speech," she looked pointedly at Taylan, "I suppose I'd better. I'd like to wish my brother a very happy birthday. He's a very nice brother, even though he can be annoying at times. But even if I had the chance, I wouldn't change him. I like the one I've got. What some of you might not know," she cast her gaze up and down the table, "is that Patrin and I were kidnapped by crusaders when we were much younger. I was so little I don't really remember anything about it, but what I do remember is that Patrin was always there for me. When I was hungry, he gave me his food, and when I was tired, he carried me on his back." The party mood was evaporating, replaced by poignancy. Kayla, in her typical way, continued blithely without noticing the change in atmosphere. "I was only 3 or 4 years old. I can't imagine what it must have been like for him, just a young boy as he was then, to be responsible for me and keep me safe. And he doesn't remind me about it every day like some brothers would. He never talks about it at all. We never talk about it. So I want to take this chance to say thank you, big brother, for saving my life. And I love you." Patrin's chin trembled and he nodded. Taylan ran her fingertips under her eyes, but the tears flowed anyway. She also exhaled in relief. Kayla hadn't put her foot in it like she usually did. Kayla went on, addressing the table. "Now we just need to get this mission over so we can go home. Patrin has never had a girlfriend, you see, and he should get one now he's grown up." She sank abruptly into her seat. Gasps and titters ran around the room, and Patrin turned beet red. Wright shot to his feet and raised his glass. "A toast to Patrin. Happy birthday." "Happy birthday," the guests echoed on cue and took a drink. 4 late arrivals entered the mess and heads swiveled toward them. Mark walked up to Patrin and bent down to whisper in her ear. "We would like to come to the party, if that's all right. If you'd rather we didn't, we'll understand." "Of course you can join us," she replied. "Of course. Where's Seren?" "She's on her way." Medwin didn't look too happy about being here, but Malir and Madog sent her apologetic smiles as people shuffled up to make room for them and found extra seats. Her heart swelled. The peace gesture was very welcome. Chapter 26. Patrin got over his embarrassment at Kayla's announcement, aided in part by several glasses of beer, and celebrations continued into the quiet shift. By the time the party was over, nearly everyone had shown their face. Iolani tore herself away from her precious habitat for a few hours, and even Colburn and Yorkson put in an appearance, though, as Taylan guessed, that was probably to ensure no one drank too much. The only two people who didn't turn up at some point couldn't, and no one would have wanted them to anyway. Taylan hadn't seen Carla or her son since the encounter at Mars Station, and if she never saw them again, it would be too soon. Wright fell into a tipsy sleep as soon as his head hit the pillow, and Taylan soon followed him, slipping into slumber contentedly. It seemed only minutes later the door chime woke her. She padded across the dark room to see who it was. Kayla's sad, tearful face appeared on the panel. Had she realised she'd embarrassed her brother at his party? "Ma'am, I had a nightmare." Glancing at Wright, who hadn't stirred at all from his usual comatose state, Taylan opened the door. "Can I come in?" Kayla asked, a catch in her voice. I'll come to your room." Somehow Kayla had managed to increase her wardrobe exponentially during the months she'd spent aboard the ship. The clothes were predictably strewn all over her cabin, and Taylan had to pick her way through them to reach Kayla's bed. The girl was so distraught by her dream, she didn't make even a half-hearted effort to tidy up. "Oh, ma'am." She plonked herself on her bunk. "I had a dream about Caris." "Lie down," Taylan said. "Tell me about it." She cuddled Kayla from behind. "I dreamt she'd climbed onto one of her birds of prey and it was flying away with her. I called out, but she didn't hear me. She didn't look back, no matter how loud I shouted. And then she was gone." "That sounds more sad than scary. Do you miss her?" "I miss her so much, ma'am. And I miss all my friends. I found out today Michaela got married." She quietly wept. "It was someone else who told me. Michaela doesn't talk to me anymore." Michaela had been Kayla's best friend. During the months of travel on the Defiant, years had passed on Earth. Kayla's friend had grown up and become a woman. She probably couldn't relate to a teenage girl now. It was sad, but it couldn't be helped. Taylan guessed Kayla's dream had something to do with the news. The usual time dilation formula didn't apply, though the physicists didn't understand why yet. Travelling through passages within the Skein complicated things. Regardless, the upshot was time passed at home much faster than it did on the ship, sometimes at unpredictable rates. Where was Caris? What was she doing? They'd received their last message from her not long after they'd set off, and she didn't answer Taylan's comms. Had she found it too painful to continue the relationship? Whatever the reason, Taylan didn't blame her. Kayla hadn't mentioned her in the party speech, but Caris was just as responsible for Kayla's survival as her brother was. Caris had kept them alive in the desert for days while Taylan searched for them. She would be forever in her debt and would never forget her. She recalled one of the last times she'd seen her adopted daughter. They'd gone as a family to see a raptor display held at the rescue centre where Caris worked. The event was a regular fundraiser, and it was to be her first time presenting. As they waited for the display to be set up, Taylan slid along the bench, moving closer to Wright. He put his arm around her. "Are you cold?" "No, I'm fine." The crowd hummed and bustled, taking their seats. He asked, "Are you having second thoughts about the mission?" "My whole life is a second thought at the moment, but no, I agreed we would go, and we will." That doesn't mean you have to like it though, right? Right. She sighed, nestling her head into his shoulder. I wish Caris was coming too. I'm going to miss her. So will the kids. She's been a part of the family for years, but she isn't a child any longer. She's her own person. If she wasn't so mature and capable, I'd argue harder with her about her decision. A hard upbringing will do that to you, Wright said. And they don't come much harder than being brought up in a cult. Patrin and Kayla were lucky to get out while they were still young. Taylan silently agreed. He continued, Caris doesn't figure in the connections that bind the rest of us. I know, but... Her words faltered to silence. There were more connections in life than the ones the Skein mappers identified. The announcer walked out into the ring, and the crowd's chatter quickly ceased. Kayla's voice broke into the quiet. Is Caris on first? Patrin elbowed her. Yes, Taylan whispered. She's on first. Her adopted daughter stepped into the ring, a falcon on her wrist. She greeted the crowd and then explained the bird she carried was called Sparky and he was a merlin. Glad it's not the other kind, Wright muttered. The merlin leapt into the air and flew over the audience's heads, bells on its jesses jangling. The crowd gasped and a few people ducked. The bird landed on a pole at the back of the stadium and perched there, blinking in the morning light. Caris took a small piece of meat from a bag at her hip and grasped it between her finger and thumb, holding it up for the bird to see. In a minute, she said, the sun will disappear behind that cloud, a wind will rise, and then Sparky will swoop down for his breakfast. Kayla said, Caris is doing really well, isn't she, ma'am? She's doing great. Exactly as Caris had predicted, the sky darkened, a breeze started up, and down came Sparky, sweeping low. It had been a beautiful day, a wonderful final family gathering. Kayla's chest was rising and falling steadily. She was asleep. An idea suddenly hit, and tears slid from Taylan's eyes. Had Kayla's dream been an omen? She had an awful feeling she would never see Caris again. Chapter 27. What do you think about joining the Antarctic project? Setia asked Elec. There's still time, but we'll have to be quick. The final deadline for applications is tomorrow. It's expensive, but you must be able to afford it. You make even more than me at this game. The first ship leaves in 6 months. He looked up from his meal. Are you serious? Why would I want to do that? You know why. Do I? Exasperated, Setia placed the interface heavily on the cafe table. The jerky movement and accompanying sound of impact attracted curious glances from some of the diners. Ordinarily, the ones who hadn't recognized Elec yet would have risen from their seats and walked over, eager to meet the leader of the fastest-growing movement in the Southern Hemisphere. But they were in a new place, a country that hadn't been exposed to Elec's oratory or Arief's publicity machine. The diners who had stopped their conversations to check out the small disturbance returned their attention to their companions. Yes, she insisted. You do. Did she have to spell it out? It looked like he was going to make her. She liked Elec. The same as most people, she found it impossible not to. In the years since they'd met, they'd grown close and even had a brief, mutually unsatisfactory sexual relationship. But sometimes he was infuriating. It isn't safe to carry on like this, she said. It was fun in the beginning, I admit. I liked being your bodyguard and destroying the knuckle-draggers. And, let's face it, you loved all the attention. That was then. This is now. Things have changed. What you're doing isn't safe anymore. Not for anyone. What I'm doing? Elec lazily lifted a forkful of his rice and bean dish to his mouth. Before popping it in, he said, I thought we were in this together. She watched as he chewed. I don't know where you get that idea. Arief asked me to help you. Signing up to your cause wasn't part of the deal. I'm not one of your followers. He smirked and swallowed. You're teasing me, she said. I'm being serious. Sorry, Setia, I couldn't resist. I know you don't believe in half of what I have to say, and in fairness, that's refreshing. Unquestioning adoration can get boring. I like having you around. Then think about what I'm telling you, or you might not have me around for much longer. Arief might have something to say about that. Arief can go suck on. Frustration had made her voice loud. The other diners had grown interested again. She leaned over the table and said at a quieter volume, Burnap's balls. My life is my own, whatever Arief might want. You say that a lot. I've always wondered who Burnap is and what his testicles have to do with anything. Burnap is a deity in my religion, a god like you want to become. Elec frowned. You have me wrong. I don't want to be a god. My aim is to empower people so they don't feel the need to obey any gods. I want them to become masters of their own destinies. Setia lifted an eyebrow. By getting them to follow you? I don't want them to follow, only listen. Coming from anyone else, Elec's words might have sounded ironic, but he was in earnest. Something she'd come to understand about him was when he said things like that, he really believed it. He was a slave to attention from others, but only because he felt he had an important message. He wanted to help people. When she'd said his goal was to become a god, she had meant he wanted people to follow his creed, intended to make them happier and fulfilled in their lives. She rubbed her temples with her fingertips to ease the headache beginning to form. I know you're sincere. If you weren't, I wouldn't help you. It certainly isn't for Arief's sake. But what's happening? What we're doing? It's getting dangerous. Elec's mouth turned down, and he pushed away his half-finished plate. You're talking about what happened at the last rally. Isn't it obvious? What else could I be talking about? At his most recent event, a combination of high temperatures and the organisers allowing too many people in had sparked a stampede. 5 attendees had been crushed to death, including a 9-year-old child. That was an accident, Elec said. It wasn't my fault. Did I say it was? Yet it happened at a gathering of your followers. If the rally hadn't happened, no one would have died. It wasn't my fault. Drops of spittle sprayed from Elec's lips. She had hit a nerve. She felt bad. Guilt over the deaths was a heavy burden to bear. She knew it too well. She bore some guilt herself. But she wanted to make Elec see sense. I didn't intend for anyone to get hurt, he went on. I want to help people. But if some suffer so that... Don't say it! So that others benefit, perhaps that's a price worth paying. You said it. She glared at him. I never had you down as the callous one. I always thought Arief took that crown. I'm not callous, only pragmatic. As he uttered the final 2 words, Elec turned away. She waited, silent. The busy chatter and movement in the cafe went on, heedless of the man and woman sitting at the window table not talking. If anyone thought anything about them at all, it was probably to surmise they were an odd couple. A woman had taken a fancy to a big foreign man, but the relationship had turned sour, the cultural differences too great. Eventually, Elec said, defeated, All right. Things have been getting out of hand. So what are we going to do about it? What will Arief allow us to do? Why is any of this up to him? What were you saying about wanting everyone to be free agents, masters of their own destinies? What about us? Arief, Arief, Arief. Screw Arief. If it wasn't for him, I would be nobody. And you told me once he did something to you that helped you fight so well. We owe him. We can't just walk away. He gets more out of this than either of us. Seeing your influence over the crowds gives him a big kick. And those people who died? Setia snapped her fingers. That was how much he cared. When Elec continued to look doubtful, she opened the interface screen and turned it to face him. These are the psychological and physical criteria for applying to be a colonist. We would have to pass the tests, but I'm sure we can. It would be the perfect escape route. Don't you see? If we tried to walk away from all this, Arief would come after us. He would talk us into coming back. You know how persuasive he is. It was more than that, but she didn't know how to put it into words. Once you were in Arief's presence, it was nearly impossible not to do whatever he wanted. She continued, "But if we leave aboard the Brez or another of Tauman's ships, what could he do then? He wouldn't be able to get at us anymore. And you would have a shipload of people to talk to about your ideas. You never know, you might bring a different way of thinking and living to a new world and start a better version of human civilization. And I would help you. I believe in you. But the way things are going here is all wrong. It's turning ugly, and I don't know how to stop it. Do you?" Elec scanned the list on the screen, but he didn't seem to be reading it. Setia could almost see the cogs of his mind whirring. She tensed, willing him to agree with her. He murmured, "I don't know." She exhaled her disappointment. "Would you think about it at least?" "I guess it wouldn't hurt," he replied doubtfully. "And don't mention a word of this to Arief. If he finds out, he'll do everything in his power to stop us. I guarantee it." What a strange situation they were in. Arief had given them both what they wanted. Elec had gone from one of those dudes spouting his opinions on street corners, ignored by passers-by, to a ground roots cultural phenomenon with hundreds of thousands of devotees. She was no longer a downtrodden street rat living on the edge and clinging to survival. She had money, power, and respect, yet it had all come with a price, unstated by the vendor at the time of the transaction. In return for Arief's offering, they had given over control of their lives. He had never stated it plainly, but it was clear from his looks and attitude there was no going back for them, no matter who suffered or how many people died. They were trapped. "I know you!" A skinny, middle-aged man in a checked shirt, dirty shorts, and blue plastic sandals was navigating the tables and customers to reach them. "I've been sitting there, thinking you looked familiar. It's Elec, right? I never expected to see you in a place like this. That's why it took me so long to recognize you." Elec smiled his public smile, a mask Setia had seen him put on many times. "Please, join us." He pulled out the empty third seat at their table. "What's your name?" Chapter 28. For the first time since the announcement of the young Marine's suicide, Yorkson had called everyone into the auditorium. On this occasion, the reason for the meeting was general knowledge. The Defiant had nearly reached her destination. The atmosphere was predictably tense. The general chatter that usually accompanied large gatherings aboard ship was absent. Even the movements of the more than 150 attendees were minimal. Quiet and stillness reigned in the packed room. Patrin and Kayla sat on each side of Taylan, and she held their hands. Wright had to be here too, though she hadn't spotted him. It was nearly crunch time. The results of the hard decision she'd made months ago were about to play out, for better or worse. Probably worse. But she had done what she thought was right. There was no going back now. "Ma'am," Kayla whispered, showing a rare moment of decorum, "you're hurting my hand." "Sorry, sweetheart." Taylan slackened her grip. Yorkson gave the command for the lighting to dim, and it reduced to a minimal level. The shadowy heads and shoulders of the audience were barely visible. The Admiral gave another command, and a starscape brightened the centre of the auditorium. Taylan counted 5 star systems, circled by the radiant specks of their planets. Yorkson cleared his throat. He'd moved out of the illumination of the stars and was entirely invisible, his voice disembodied. "Ladies and gentlemen, officers and marines, thank you for coming. We are at the most crucial part of our mission. I have called this briefing to update you on the latest information we have regarding our enemy. The Skein mappers have narrowed down the source of the interference in Earth affairs to these 5 neighbouring systems. At this time, they are unable to provide us with more detailed intelligence. This is somewhat of a setback. The Alliance anticipated tackling the aliens on their home turf, in the same way they gate-crashed our system. We have only 1 ship. Should we visit all the systems? If so, in what order? Scan data is being assessed as I speak, and we hope to glean facts to help inform our decision-making. However, an alternative interpretation is possible. The Skein mappers speculate the aliens may inhabit all the systems, that they represent a confederation. Perhaps long ago, the species spread out to colonize nearby habitable planets. Or perhaps life is abundant in this corner of the galaxy, and we are dealing with not 1 but up to 5 intelligent life forms. It is a frustrating problem, and, I make no bones about it, a dangerous one. The military among you know the wisdom of avoiding going in blind wherever possible. It seems in this case we might have to go in blind, deaf, and lacking most of our other senses too. In response to murmurs of alarm he said, "I do not mean to scare you, only warn you. We don't know what to expect, and so when we do hopefully encounter these beings, you must expect the unexpected." A voice called out, "All I'm hearing is a lot of speculation. What's the plan?" It was Malir. He and his brothers must have decided to lend their hands to the common cause after all. Yorkson replied, "Good question. The plan will remain flexible as long as we have new data coming in, but for now, it is to approach the nearest planet and attempt to make contact. Worlds in all 5 systems display signs of life. We currently have no way of ascertaining which one harbours the aliens who visit Earth, if any." "And what if we can't make contact?" This time Medwin was the speaker. Taylan would recognise his gruff tones anywhere. "Then we attempt to land the shuttle with a delegation aboard." Medwin asked sarcastically, "And I don't suppose one of the delegation is going to be you?" "I will be in the party, yes." This seemed to silence Medwin. After a short pause, Malir said, "I would like to be aboard the vessel myself." "You are most welcome, sir." "How will you choose the other members of the delegation?" The question had come from Iolani. "I think for everyone else it will be best to let the Skein mappers advise us, but I am happy to listen to expressions of interest. For now, the choosing is somewhat premature. We have another week before we reach the nearest system, and then we must try to establish contact. This may take some time, as there are many avenues to explore." Medwin growled, "If that Merlin fella wants to talk to us, he will." "You may be correct," Yorkson agreed. "That's about all I have to tell you today. Any questions?" Taylan only half listened to the inquiries and the Admiral's responses. Her mind was on the delegation Yorkson had mentioned. She wasn't in any doubt she would be in it, and so would Wright and Arthur. If the Skein mappers said Patrin and Kayla should go too, should she agree or say no? One thing putting her off allowing her kids to go to the alien planet wasn't the threat the hostile species posed, but other members of the visiting party. She was in no doubt Carla and Perrin Orr would be chosen too, and she had no intention of allowing the pair anywhere near her offspring. Carla was as evil as Morgan and Merlin, if not more so. "Taylan," she looked up. A Batcher was standing in front of her. People were getting up from their seats. The meeting was over. Patrin and Kayla were on their way to the exit. "How about a sparring session?" a Batcher asked. "For old time's sake." "Now?" "It's as good a time as any, unless you have something else you need to do." "No, I'm free. It's just—" She sought out her children again, but they'd left. "Sure, let's do it now." In all the ancient fighting arts practice sessions, somehow she'd never worked with a Batcher. It had always been Patrin or Arthur who had tutored or sparred with him. As they stepped into the gym in their protective gear, she said, "You know, I don't think we've done this since the Valiant." "You could be right. It's been a long time. A lot's happened in between for both of us, right?" "You're not kidding." "And now," he went on, "here we are again, back at the beginning." She lightly punched his arm. "Don't get all philosophical on me, Abacha. That was never our style." "What's it to be? How's your sword fighting coming along?" "Like I would be dumb enough to go up against you with a sword. I pick knives. That way I'll stand a chance." "Knives it is. It isn't going to make any difference, my friend." They collected the blunt practice weapons and squared up. Taylan tossed her knife from one hand to the other. Abacha sighed and shook his head. The gear they wore was wired to give audible signals when a blade made contact, and the number of sounds indicated the severity of the blow. A single tone meant a non-serious wound, right up to 4 tones in succession, which meant the receiver was immediately incapacitated and the blow was mortal without urgent medical attention. Taylan leapt in and jabbed Abacha's shoulder. As she leapt out again, a single tone sounded. Abacha cursed. "Too damn light on your feet. Wait till I pin you down. You won't be so fast then." She laughed. He copied her maneuver. His words had been a bluff, but she jerked sideways in time to avoid the hit anyway and dragged her knife across his ribs as he retreated. 2 tones sounded. Damn it. Abacha had always been good-humoured about being beaten, unlike almost every other burly Royal Marine she'd fought. So they continued, Taylan getting in minor but regular hits, Abacha trying the same but mostly failing. They could carry on like this for a long time, but eventually Abacha's gear would sound the incapacitation notes anyway. In a real fight he would have suffered death by 1,000 cuts. But fighting like this was boring. It was time to end it. She waited until the next time Abacha made his move, switched her knife to her other hand, took the hit to her arm, grabbed his neck and pulled him down with her free hand. Then she kneed him in the diaphragm, not too hard. Air exploded from his lungs. As he hovered, bent double, trying to breathe, she axe-kicked him between the shoulder blades. He toppled head first to the deck. She sat on his back, grasped his chin and stretched out his neck. She didn't bother making the killing blow. "Concede?" "Goddamn pain in the ass." She chuckled and climbed off him. She didn't apologize. That would be condescending. "Another round?" "Unless you mean beer," he replied, getting to his feet. "The answer's no." "I'm fine with beer too." As they walked to the showers, she said, "If it makes any difference, you should know the way I am is due to Merlin. If it wasn't for him, you could probably beat me easily." "What's that waste of space got to do with your fighting?" "You're going to laugh, but—" Should she tell him she was descended from Lancelot? It was too outlandish. He would think she was crazy. "Merlin did something to my family. I suppose you could call it casting a spell on us. My fighting skills are in my bloodline. My dad was the same as me, and that's why Patrin's as good as he is." "You mean it isn't because he's big as a horse?" "Huh, that too." "How do you know? Did Merlin tell you?" "Arthur did." "I guess he would know." Abacha halted at the door to the men's showers. "So if it wasn't for Merlin, I would beat you at fighting and Shang-Chi." She laughed. "That's moot." He opened the door. "By the way, whatever happened to that old cad of yours?" "Boots? He died last year." "I'm sorry." "Thanks. I was pretty cut up about it." "Hey, Abacha, can I ask you a question?" "Shoot." "Are you an insomniac?" He cocked an eyebrow. "Hell no." Instantly, realization hit his features. He spluttered, sometimes I have trouble." His words petered out. "Got you, you fibber." "You did, but I lied for a good cause. When did you guess?" "I'm not sure. Sometime when I was out in the Australian outback, I think. Thanks for what you did for me back then. I appreciate it." "No problem, little chick." As Taylan showered, she recalled those late nights aboard the Corvette HMSS Daisy, when the two of them had whiled away the hours playing Shang-Chi. He'd pretended he also couldn't sleep so he could be a friend to someone he sensed was in pain. Little chick. He knew she hated it when he called her that. She smiled. Chapter 29. The sparring session in the gym with Abacha felt like a watershed moment. As Taylan curled up next to Wright that night, it came to her that her old friend had asked to fight, to reconnect, because it might be their last chance. In a few days they would be facing the aliens interfering in Earth affairs, and no one had the slightest idea what might happen. It was a time for just-in-case goodbyes, final words, a time to make peace and ask forgiveness. The following morning she went to see Malir and his brothers. The last time she'd done this, the reception she'd received hadn't exactly been welcoming. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the door chime. "Taylan," Malir said gravely in greeting. He was sitting down, pulling on a sock. Madog and Medwin seemed to be waiting for him. "Bad news is back again," Medwin spat. "What is it this time? The Alliance is planning on putting everyone from West BI out the airlock. Carla Orr is going to bunk in our cabin." "I don't know how you can blame me for telling you the truth," Taylan complained. "Unless you'd rather I kept what I knew a secret." "No," said Malir. "He doesn't mean that. Do you, Medwin?" The brother softly growled a reply, but she couldn't make it out. Addressing her, Malir said, "Come in. Don't stand in the doorway like an idiot." When she stepped into the cabin, he went on, "We are grateful to you for letting us know the truth. Yorkson is still denying it, but I know who to believe." "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Are you going to sit out the mission, like you said?" "We haven't." At the same time, Medwin replied, "Yes." Malir finished, "Come to a decision." "I'm not helping them," said Medwin. "Whatever you might say, brother. And that's your choice. But this family has acted as one all our lives. That was how Mam, bless her soul, brought us up, to support each other. There's strength in numbers, she always said. Wrong, said Medwin. That was how we acted all our lives until she turned up. Even if he hadn't given Taylan a narrowed glance, it was clear to all present who he meant. In the awkward pause that followed, Taylan said, "About that." "Yes?" asked Madog, hands on hips. It was a challenge. She swallowed. She hadn't prepared what she wanted to say, and now, with all three brothers watching her expectantly, her mind was suddenly blank. The door slid open, and Mark walked in. She groaned. It was exactly the wrong timing. If they began a discussion on what had happened on Unis Morn with Mark around, he would defend her, which would spark Medwin to attack, and then there would be a big argument. "Taylan," said Mark. "Nice to see. What are you doing?" She was pushing him by his chest out of the cabin. "Could you wait outside for a bit?" Okay." The closing door cut off the view of his surprised expression. She turned to face the three men. They, of all the West BI resistance, had done so much to help her. They had literally saved her life. Perhaps it would be best to start with that. "First of all, thanks for coming to Patrin's party. I appreciate the gesture. It meant a lot. But I think there's more to be said before we can mend our bridges." She paused before going on. "I also want to thank you for all you did for me. You gave me supplies and equipment to use when I was trying to find my kids. Supplies and equipment you could scarce afford to give. When I got shot, you nursed me back to health. If it wasn't for you guys, I would never have made it to Australia and my kids would be dead. There's no price I can pay, nothing I can give, that's sufficient payment for everything you did." "Oh, you paid us back all right," Medwin commented wryly. She ignored him. "I never intended, that night on Anise Morn, for Mark to help me. He guessed what I was doing and he wanted to come along. I tried to stop him, but he wouldn't have it. In the end, I did let him help. That's on me. Maybe I should have argued harder and he would have listened eventually. Then he wouldn't have been hurt." Somewhere in the three men's frowns, she saw the pain of seeing their brother badly burned, the sense of betrayal from her after everything they'd done, and the disgust that she'd sided with Crusaders over her own people. She didn't know how to make that look go away. Perhaps the subject would always be sore. It was time to put it to bed, once and for all. "But I didn't argue," she said. "I accepted that Mark was doing what he wanted to do. He'd weighed up the facts and come to his own decision, and I respected that. He was acting of his own free will. He suffered terrible consequences, but that's on him, not me." It was harsh, but true. The men's frowns hardened, but she wasn't going to back down now. She'd hit on the heart of their disagreement. "You all see Mark as your baby brother, someone to protect. But even all those years ago at Anise Morn, he was already a grown man. He'd been big enough and strong enough to carry me all the way back to your hideout, remember? How old was he? 21? 22? My point is, he had a right to decide for himself. The exact same right you were complaining the Alliance took from you when it lied to you." The men gave no reply. Even Medwin had nothing to say for once. She continued, "You're never going to agree with me about what Mark and I did. I wanted to protect the Crusaders' innocent children. You saw any harm that came to them as unfortunate collateral damage. You weighed their hurt against the hurt our kids had suffered. I couldn't think like that, and I never will. But when it comes to Mark, I'm asking you to let this go and stop blaming me." Medwin said, "We came to your stupid party, and my brothers are speaking to you again, stars help them. Why isn't that enough for you? What do you care how we feel about what you did to Mark?" "Because if you can forgive and forget, then maybe I can too." "Forgive us?" Medwin spluttered. "Forgive myself." Despite all she had said about Mark's right to choose what he did, his body-encompassing burns from the incendiary device, the clinging oil continuing to melt his skin, remained an image seared into her mind and heart. If she knew his siblings didn't believe his injuries had been her fault, that could help stop it haunting her. Seconds of silence ticked past. Then Maelor got up from his bunk and crossed the cabin to her side. The big man enveloped her in his arms and she sank into his chest. He didn't say anything, but it didn't matter. Nothing needed to be said. When he released her, she caught Madog's gaze. He gave a small nod. Medwin was looking down, refusing to go along with his brother's change of heart. Oh well, 2 out of 3 isn't bad. The door opened. Mark said, "I've been out here 5 minutes. Can I come in now?" Seren had arrived and was waiting with him. Taylan noticed something about her she realised she should have noticed a long time ago. There was no mistaking the bump that rounded out her belly. "Seren, I didn't know you were pregnant." She smiled and stepped into the cabin with Mark. "We only found out after we left Mars. I've been trying to disguise it for months." "But there's no disguising it now," said Mark proudly. "You've been getting medical care?" asked Taylan gently. The news was not as joyful as it would have been on Earth, Pregnancy wasn't technically allowed in space. As well as space travel being inherently dangerous, there were known risks to the fetus from radiation. The medical staff aboard would have strongly advised termination. "Yes, the doctor's been great," Seren replied. She added, her eyes shining. "I couldn't get rid of it. I just couldn't." "I understand," Taylan said. "It's a shame you didn't tell me earlier. I've been through it twice myself. I could have helped you." "I didn't want anyone to know," Seren explained. "I didn't want to be judged. But now the cat's out the bag anyway, I might take you up on that." Taylan said goodbye to the family and returned to her cabin, where Wright was only just awake. He opened his eyes sleepily.
"Where have you been?"
"I went to see the brothers from West BI." His eyes snapped wide and he shot to a sitting position.
"Stars, Taylan, what did you tell them this time?"
"Don't worry," she replied, climbing onto the bed. She lay down next to him. "It was something between me and them. We're good now." Chapter 30.
"I thought you might be one of the chosen few,"
Wright said, as Iolani joined the group waiting at the shuttle bay. "You did?" she replied. "You're better at this than me. I thought I was only here as a consultant or maybe to create the habitat. I've never met these aliens you call Merlin and Morgan."
"You're our resident expert on living organisms. You gave some interesting insights while we were on the Dauntless. I thought what you said about the alien species being very long-lived made a lot of sense."
"Huh, not that anyone took any notice of me."
"They're taking notice now. The Skein mappers have spoken."
The space was beginning to fill up. The final list of names for the delegation had gone out at breakfast, and now everyone was arriving. Taylan looked like she was having the worst day of her life. She was pale and haggard, and her shoulders drooped. But he couldn't say or do anything to help her. Patrin and Kayla's names had been on the list, and they would be going to the planet with her and the rest of the team. Even the presence of her friends from the Resistance days wasn't cheering her up. She had barely raised a wan smile when they'd entered the bay. Arthur was here naturally, along with Colburn, Abacha, Kevin and Ford. Yorkson's name hadn't been flagged by the mappers, which was probably just as well. The Defiant needed her admiral. If something bad happened and none of the delegation made it back to the ship, she needed someone to get everyone else home. Some Marines who weren't on the list would be coming along too, seasoned troops for backup in case of conflict. No one had any idea whether that was likely or the aliens had another plan in store. They had to know humans had come all the way from Earth to find them. What they would do about it was anyone's guess. Their planet, assuming it was their planet, showed no sign of organic life, though it was capable of supporting it. The gravity and atmosphere were so similar to Earth's, there was no particular need for the delegation to wear armoured EVA suits, though they were wearing them nevertheless as a precaution. Yorkson had picked a landmass near the equator at random as the landing site. The ship's scanners hadn't picked up any signs of artificial constructions where the aliens might live or work. It was baffling, but they had no choice except to attempt to make contact. Yorkson walked into the bay. "Good morning, everyone. I've come to wish you bon voyage. If I could give you some final advice, I would. But unfortunately, this is a situation that's new to all of us, and we must play it by ear. We will be in constant contact for the duration of your trip and while you're on the surface. Brigadier Colburn is to be your commanding officer for military and civilians alike, so please be sure to follow her orders to the letter."
Taylan will be overjoyed.
But when Wright looked for her reaction, she didn't appear to have even heard what Yorkson said. 2 more figures appeared, accompanied by guards. Carla Orr and her son had arrived. A palpable shiver ran through the group, and an icy pall fell on the general atmosphere. Orr and her offspring stood some distance away, but the change in their appearance since the beginning of the voyage was noticeable. Both looked unhealthy from their long incarceration. Hollowed shadows surrounded their eyes and their cheekbones stuck out. "That's it," said the Admiral. "Time to board." He stood at the ramp, shook the hand of each civilian as they passed him, and returned the Marines' salutes. Wright was reminded of Hans Jonter doing a similar thing when they'd boarded the shuttle that would take them to the Defiant, only no media reps were here to watch and report. This was not for show. As they took their seats, Taylan asked him, "What are you going to be on this mission?" "What do you mean?" "Are you my husband and stepfather to my kids, or are you Lieutenant Colonel Wright, Royal Marine?" "Can't I be both?" "Can you? If it comes down to it, and you have to choose between your family and your duty, which will you pick?" "I can't see how that'll be a choice I have to make." The look she gave him cut him to his soul. He took her hand. "You, Patrin, and Kayla come first." The surface of the alien planet was a dry, dusty place. A black plain stretched out to distant bare hills under a pale orange sky. The black dust hung in the air, creating a haze that faintly obscured the dismal view. "We are the first human beings to set foot on an exoplanet," announced Colburn. "We have beaten Talman's colonization project. Drink in the experience, ladies and gentlemen, for no one else will be able to say they've done the same." The Brigadier was waxing unusually eloquent, but Wright felt a sense of anticlimax. There was nothing here. No Merlin, Morgan, or any other aliens. Not even any living organisms as far as he could tell. If it weren't for the different colouring and Earth-like gravity and atmosphere, they could be back on Mars. "This is it?" asked Kevin. "I've seen more life in the outback. The Skein mappers must have it wrong. Nothing's ever lived here." "I don't get it," said Iolani. She was squatting down, running a handful of soil through her fingers. "In these conditions I would expect this area to be teeming with life. I would need to look at this stuff under a microscope, but it appears entirely barren." She stood up. "We know from Talman's probes that living organisms exist on other worlds, even if they aren't intelligent. Life isn't that rare." "So why aren't we seeing it?" Colburn asked. "I'm sorry, I have no idea." "Is it possible it died out?" "Species go extinct all the time, but a planetary-wide wipeout? Extremely unlikely. Once life appears, it usually becomes self-sustaining. It's very difficult to eradicate. An event of the magnitude to sterilize an entire planet would leave signs. Background radiation, evidence of a massive impact, something. I've examined the scanned data. There's nothing like that here. No reason for the lack of life. I found it hard to believe until now." Colburn asked, "Could we simply be unlucky, and we happen to have landed in a particularly lifeless area? Should we try somewhere else?" "With respect," said Mailer, "this isn't an exploratory expedition. We aren't planning on colonizing the place. We're here to find the aliens that have been interfering in our affairs. Where are they? If they're as all-seeing as everyone makes out, they must know we're here. Rather than flying off somewhere else, shouldn't we stick around and wait for them to come to us?" "We could be waiting a long time," said Wright. "I've a feeling that if they really wanted to speak to us, they'd be here already." Arthur chipped in, "Merlin would not waste any time if he wanted to meet us. Either he is not here, or he does not wish to grant us an audience." "My money is on the latter," Taylan muttered. "Maybe they're still deciding what to do about us," said Kevin. "If you're a bully and your victim turns up on your doorstep, what do you do?" "I would not hesitate," said a deep female voice. "I would squash them flat." It was the first time Carla Orr had spoken so far. During all of the trip down to the surface, putting on their EVA suits, walking out and seeing the planet, neither she nor her son had said a word. And now she had said something. Her tone sent a shiver down Wright's spine. There was a creepy edge to it, a note of madness. Colburn walked away from the group, out over the dusty ground. The soil was so fine and dry, it lifted in soft puffs at each of her footsteps. Everyone watched her in silence. A wind swept over the plain, raising a black cloud. The Brigadier covered about 50 meters before turning and walking back. Perhaps she was in a one-to-one with Yorkson. She reached them. We wait. Chapter 31. Elec was fast becoming a global phenomenon. Setia hadn't been able to help but watch with a mixture of pride and fear as his followers grew into their millions. It had taken years for the word-of-mouth movement to take hold, but once people joined, they stayed. It was not a flash-in-the-pan thing, a viral media takeover, here one day and gone the next. It was a long-lasting, vital doctrine. Elec would not have called it that. He would have called it a philosophy, a way of thinking, not a belief system. But his people carried a fervour that was plain to anyone with eyes to see. It was like the old Crusader cult, though dressed up more nicely with clever words and phrases like self-determination, development of the individual spirit, and personal sovereignty. The result was the same. Elec was worshipped. And he kind of liked it. That was what disappointed Setia. She'd known him a long time, from the earliest days in downtown Spiral City. They'd been similar then. Like her, he'd come from a rough background, owning little more than the clothes on his back. Consequently, also like her, he'd been humble, grateful simply for a full stomach and a day that passed without trouble. The only difference between them had been his desire to improve the lot of the lowest in society. She, on the other hand, had believed it was up to every man and woman to improve their own lot, if they so chose, and that avoiding people like Praetam was probably a good first step. She still believed that. As to what Elec truly believed now, she wasn't sure anymore. He'd changed. She'd given him a chance to get out a few months ago, and he hadn't taken it. Her perspective on her friend had altered that day. It had been like she was seeing the new Elec for the first time. She didn't like what she saw.
Setia, are you ready?
Arief had opened the door to her room. She was surprised he'd come himself. The movement had any number of members willing to be unpaid servants and perform menial tasks like reminding Elec's right-hand woman of her duties. Not only were the workers unpaid, they often donated their own money for the privilege. Yes, she replied dully. I'll be there in a minute.
Don't be late. This event is more important than most.
He left. He'd been referring to the fact that Hans Jonter, former Prime Minister of the Britannic Isles, would be attending. Jonter lending his face to Elec's campaign would carry a lot of weight, even though he was now a has-been. She wasn't sure if that was the ex-PM's intention or if he was only curious and wanted to see the man behind all the chatter. Nowadays, Elec had a retinue of bodyguards. Her services were no longer required, but for some reason it pleased Arief to see her still performing her role, albeit in a symbolic capacity. Whenever she stood at the leader's side, dressed in her uniform, it would bring a sly smile to his face. She'd never figured out what it was about. Why wouldn't he accept her resignation? What did it matter to him if she left or stayed? Did it have something to do with what he'd done to her in that alley when she'd faced Solaire? She would gladly let him take back her strange abilities, but maybe he couldn't. Knowing Arief, it was more likely he wouldn't. Sighing, she got to her feet. The stadium was packed. By all accounts, it was the largest crowd Elec had ever gathered. Bright in the spotlights, he stood before a sea of faces covering all available space. Setia couldn't imagine what it must be like to stand in the audience, people pressing on every side, but no one seemed bothered. Every face shone with excitement. Such was the devotion Elec inspired. She took up her position near the edge of the stage, ready to repel overexcited fans who decided to try to get up close and personal with their idol. Elec began to speak, and the buzz of the watchers instantly faded to silence. Setia shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She had heard him say roughly the same things for years, sometimes varying a theme or telling a new story, but it was always the identical messages. He couldn't be blamed for that, but she was heartily tired of listening to him. Arief stood in the wings on the opposite side of the stage, looking beyond Elec into the crowd. Even at the distance, Setia could make out his dark eyes moving hungrily, as if eating the adulation. She wanted to vomit, but she was stuck for another couple of hours at least. To distract herself, she allowed her mind to wander back to her youth. She recalled Aulia, a good friend. What had happened to her? What were things like in Spiral City now? Was Praetam still plying his trade, or had the authorities caught up with him? Distant voices dragged her back to the present. On the far side of the stadium, opposite where Elec stood, a dispute had started up. The shouts were too far away to make out what was being said. Heads in the audience turned, however. Elec paused. Others could be heard now, telling the arguers to shut up. "Be ready," said a voice in Setia's ear. It was Arief speaking through her comm. "Ready for what?" she asked. "What's going on?" "It has begun," was all Arief would say. She commed the in-crowd security for information on the situation, but her operatives happened to be far from the disturbance, and people were crammed in so tightly they could only move slowly toward it. Then the screaming started. In the half-light hanging over the stadium, pulse fire flashed out. The shots seemed to be coming from the same place as the arguing voices. Setia cursed and yelled into her mic. The operatives in the audience had to get to the shooters now. At the same time, she rushed onto the stage. Elec was standing there like a dumbass, transfixed by the mass shooting taking place before his eyes. "Get down!" she shouted, pulling him to the floor. "It's you they really want!" Keeping him low, she pushed him to the side of the stage. "But why?" he asked incredulously as he crawled along. "Why would anyone do this?" "Because people are crazy. What do you think I've been doing all this time? There are always maniacs out to get you. They've just upped their game." They'd reached the wings. She pushed him out of sight. He was safe for the moment, but she needed to get him to an armoured car and away from this place. As she put in the call, she spotted Arief. He remained in the same area he'd stood all along, gazing out over the crowd. The pleasure written on his features was sickening. Chapter 32. Patrin leaned apathetically on the shuttle's hull, his gaze running along the horizon. The wind was whipping up black dust devils in the deep orange dusk. Hours had passed, and there was no sign of the aliens. Almost everyone had gone into the shuttle to sit down. Maybe he should do that too, but the prospect seemed even more boring than waiting outside. A large figure loomed in the corner of his vision. No one else matched his height. "Arthur, I thought you'd gone inside with the others." "I had, but I came out again. You and I never seemed to have an opportunity to speak alone with each other, not since the days of your riding lessons." "You're right." When he thought about it, Patrin suspected Mam of keeping him away from the king. "I miss those lessons. They were great, until the last one." Was that why his mother had gone to lengths to ensure he and Arthur were never alone together? He'd never told her about the assassination attempt, but she could have found out about it another way.
I enjoyed them too, even though the final one was eventful. Patrin, now I have you alone. I would like to tell you something.
The king's tone was serious. Patrin looked around. Only the Marines remained outside the shuttle, guarding it in case the aliens decided to put in an appearance.
What is it? I have a strong foreboding something bad is going to happen. I knew Merlin most of my life, and though I never guessed he was not from Earth, I believe I grew to know him well. He will not take this visit favourably. He enjoys having human beings under his control, and by coming here we are challenging his power. He won't like it, and he will seek to punish us. The same applies to Morgan, only more so. She is truly evil. You can see it in Carla Orr and Perrin. Morgan's poison runs like quicksilver in their veins. That's what you wanted to tell me? Patrin asked. I appreciate it, but I don't think that's news to anyone. That is not all.
Arthur placed a hand on Patrin's shoulder.
My boy, though you are not of my blood, you are like a son to me, the son I would have preferred over the one I was given.
Patrin was touched.
That's a great honour, sir. The foreboding I feel extends doubly to you. I don't know if it's due to my affection for you or because the story of my life is playing out again. Many events that have occurred since I was woken from my long sleep have felt like that to me.
He leaned close until their helmets were nearly touching.
There may come a time very soon when the opportunity arises to risk your life on my behalf. I am asking you now, do not do it. I don't think that's likely. Mam won't allow me anywhere near any action. That's what the Royal Marine... No one knows what the next few hours or days hold. No one. My heart tells me we are moving toward a cataclysm from which few will escape. I hope with all my being you are one of them. I ask you again, do not risk yourself for my benefit. My life has been rich and long. If the end comes soon, I shall not rue it. Do you understand?
I understand, sir. The king squeezed his shoulder and then walked away. A fizz of excitement had replaced Patrin's boredom, though he had no idea what half of the conversation had been about. He supposed he'd meant it when he had agreed to not do anything dangerous to save Arthur, but he still strongly doubted the situation would even come up. Mam was like one of Caris's hawks when it came to protecting him. She would whisk Carla and him as far away from any trouble as she could at the first sight of it. Patrin? Kayla had arrived. Mam says you have to come inside. You can't stay out here without her. It isn't safe.
I thought she might say that. Why didn't she comm me?
She has been comming you. Are you coming in? He realised he'd closed other channels for his one-to-one with Arthur and hadn't noticed the bleeps.
Yes, I'm coming.
As they walked to the ramp, Kayla said, I'm really sorry about my speech at your birthday party.
Why? I thought it was sweet.
I mean the bit about you never having a girlfriend. I shouldn't have said that. I don't know why it popped out. I'm always saying the wrong thing.
It's okay, sis. I know you didn't mean to do it.
They passed through the airlock and into the passenger cabin, where the sound of chatter was loud. Carla Orr and Perrin were the only people who were silent, sitting at the back, handcuffed to their armrests. The other passengers were sitting in groups. Mam was deep in conversation with the men from West BI. TJ was sitting with them too, though he wasn't speaking. He looked as bored as Patrin had felt a few minutes ago. It only took a moment for Patrin to realise why. He strode down the aisle to the huddle. You're back at last, his mother said. Don't go out there by yourself again, okay?
I won't. Ma'am, don't you think it would be more polite to speak English around TJ? He can't understand a word you're all saying.
Oh shit. She grasped TJ's forearm, saying, "Sorry." Turning to the men, she said, "English, guys, English." They also apologised in the main language of the Britannic Isles. But before they could continue their conversation, Brigadier Colburn stood up at the front of the cabin. "Orders have arrived to return to the Defiant. Please prepare for takeoff." "What's happening?" asked Melier. "Are we coming back here later or trying something else?" "We will try another planet," Colburn replied. Patrin sat down and fastened his safety belt. He couldn't see much point in attempting to make contact in another of the star systems the Skein mappers had identified. From all he'd heard about the aliens, if they wanted to speak to them, they would. The experience here seemed to say that wasn't going to happen. Maybe Arthur had got it wrong. The shuttle departed from the site of humanity's first encounter with an exoplanet into a darkening sky. Their attempt to challenge the aliens interfering in Earth affairs had come and gone without any kind of result. "I hope they're all like this," Taylan said. "All the planets we visit?" Wright asked. "Every single one. I hope they're all dreary and boring and lifeless, and we can pack up and go home. We can tell the Skein mappers they're on something, and they need a serious rethink." "I suppose it is possible they got it all wrong. The scientists only have the files they were sent from the Dauntless. No explanations or feedback on their interpretation of the information. I don't know enough about it to even guess." "Me neither," said Taylan. "It doesn't stop me hoping. I'm really sorry about excluding you from the conversation back there, by the way. I wasn't thinking." "To be honest, it's quite flattering. You all seem to think of me as one of the group, and so I should naturally speak your language, and I like listening to it, even though I don't understand a word. Do you remember on the Valiant when I assumed you and Arthur could understand each other?" Yeah, I do. I haven't heard him speak his native tongue for a long time, but from memory it did sound familiar, just not comprehensible." "That was ignorant of me." "No, it was an easy mistake to make. After all, he is from the same place, only not the same time. You weren't to know, and you were kind and compassionate in the way you treated him, even when he was out of control. That was one of the first things I liked about you." She rested her head on his shoulder. The scene outside the window was fading to black, and stars were winking to life. A streak of light flew past. "What was that?" she asked, sitting up. Others in the cabin had seen it too. People craned their necks to see out the windows. A second streak cut across the blackness, brighter than the first. The light briefly illuminated the cabin. Alarmed voices rose. At the back, the Marines began to put on their helmets. A second later, Colburn's command arrived over the intercom. Civilians had to do the same. "Please check your safety belts are securely fastened," she added. "What does it mean?" Taylan asked. "I think we're under attack," Wright replied, before lowering his helmet over his head. The next time he spoke, it was via comm. "Taylan, I need to help Colburn with this." "You said me and the kids come first." "Don't worry, I won't forget about you." He got out of his seat and ran down the aisle. Before he'd reached the Brigadier, another flash of light exploded. The cabin turned dark and the shuttle dipped. "Ma'am?" Kayla asked. She and Patrin were sitting across the aisle. "What's going on?" "I've a feeling the aliens decided to pay us a visit after all. There's no need to worry. We'll be all right. We just need to make it back to the Defiant." In truth, she was very worried. If the aliens were attacking them as Wright guessed, they were in extreme danger in the shuttle. It was armoured and carried defensive weaponry, but it was no match for a military starship, especially not the kind Merlin and Morgan's species could build. About a minute passed with no more light streaks. Wright was in consultation with Colburn, and the Marines had readied their arms. The civilians were simply confused. No one had told them anything since the command to put on their helmets. Surely they must be nearly at the Defiant. The trip to the surface had taken less than an hour, and it must have been at least 45 minutes since they'd taken off. Several Marines left their seats and stood in the aisle, lined up facing the airlock. Wright crossed the cabin to join them. He and Colburn seemed to expect the aliens to try to board. Taylan leaned out from her seat and looked back, making eye contact with Arthur. She opened a comm. "Do you know what's going on?" He shook his head.
TJ told me to stay in my seat, but when the Dauntless was attacked, the Merlins and Morgans came through the airlock. That must be what they think might happen here.
The Merlins and Morgans, plural?
There were many of them, all the same. They were carrying pulse rifles, the same as the ones the Royal Marines use.
Shit. She switched her comm to speak to Patrin and Kayla. "If the airlock is breached, get down as low as you can and don't lift your heads until I or TJ tell you."
"Is someone going to try to board us?" Patrin asked.
"Maybe. I don't know. Just remember what I said." None of it made any sense. The aliens had to have the technological capability to vaporize the shuttle, and the Defiant for that matter. If they'd developed the ability to transform into galaxy-faring clouds, to move starships vast distances, to live thousands of years, they were vastly more advanced than humans. Maybe that was it. They were playing. They were having fun at their visitors' expense, showing them who was boss. A light so bright it blinded her flamed out. Simultaneously, a crackling hiss burst over Taylan's comm. The shuttle veered right so hard she was slammed to the left. "Hold on!" she yelled to her kids. "Hold on to something, anything, and don't let go." An ear-splitting crack resounded through the cabin. It was as she'd predicted. The shuttle's hull had been breached. The split was out of sight somewhere up ahead, but its general position was clear from the way everything loose flew toward it. The Marines in the aisle battled against the escaping atmosphere and flying objects to return to their seats.
"Taylan, are you okay?"
It was Wright.
"You and the kids are strapped in, right?"
"We're fine." Patrin and Kayla were hunched over and were holding on to their armrests like life itself. "Where are you?" she asked. "Are you in the seat?" She could no longer distinguish him from the other Marines in their identical EVA suits.
"Working on it. We're nearly home. The pilot says another 2 minutes.
2 minutes was a long time when you were under attack, and a long distance in space travel terms. Another hit like that, and they wouldn't make it. "Right, come back. There's nothing else you can do now."
"I'll try."
She leaned out, trying to spot him. Most of the Marines had made it back to their seats. "There he is!" One Marine detached from the rest, his body bent against the force of depressurization. Gripping seat backs, he slowly made his way up the aisle. When he reached their seat, she grabbed him and held on to him until his safety belt was fastened. The blinding light flashed again, and suddenly the rush of escaping air was silent. Taylan could hear nothing at all via external comm. Confused, she looked up and then down the cabin. As her gaze travelled to the rear, her heart stopped. The tail section was gone. At the end of the aisle was nothing but empty space. The final rows of Marines had been lost, either killed in the blast or tossed into the vacuum. This close to the planet, they would be drawn in by its gravity and plummet to the surface.
"Holy shit,"
Wright breathed. The place where he'd been standing a moment before had vanished. "The engines are on the wings, aren't they?" asked Taylan.
"Uh-huh. We still have a chance."
He began to get up.
"I need to..."
"No, stay here. What can you realistically do?" His shoulders slumped.
"You're right. Those men and women, though."
"Where's Colburn?"
"She survived, but only just. Her row's now the last one."
Taylan looked back again. There was nothing any of the people nearest the hole could do except hope the shuttle held together.
"We're here,"
said Wright. The starship up ahead was a welcome sight, the opening to her landing bay even better to see. The shuttle flew in and bumped down like a fledgling on its first flight, leaving the cabin hanging at a crazy angle. They were back. They'd made it. How long the respite would last was anyone's guess. Chapter 33. Patrin, Kayla, go to Patrin's cabin and lock the door. Taylan gave each of them a pulse rifle she'd taken from the shuttle's store. She'd also taken one for herself. Don't take off your armour, and if anyone tries to break in, use these. You know how. Don't hesitate to shoot, and don't come out until I, TJ, or someone you trust tells you it's safe. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she took a close look at her kids, praying it wasn't for the last time. "What are you going to do, ma'am?" Kayla asked tremulously. "If the aliens attack, I'm going to help defend the ship." "Can't you stay with us?" "I can't, sweetheart. I'm sorry. They're going to need everyone they can get, especially since losing those poor men and women on the shuttle."
"I want to fight too," said Patrin.
"No, you're too young."
"But I—"
"This isn't a discussion." Softening her tone, she explained, "I need you to look after Kayla, like you did before, okay? I need you to do it for my peace of mind, and you're not trained to fight like a Marine. I am." She hugged them both. "Do what I say now, please." Patrin and Kayla obediently left. She watched them go, a gash ripping through her heart. She was suddenly at home in West BI, thrusting a screaming Kayla into the arms of an old woman, asking her to look after her children. Was she making the same mistake again? Would it be better to keep them by her side?
"Taylan!"
Wright was running toward her. "What's happening?" she asked. Everything had been in turmoil since the shuttle landed. The survivors from the trip to the alien planet had scrambled to get out of the destroyed vessel, and personnel on the Defiant were racing to and fro as alarms sounded.
"We're at battle stations,"
Wright replied.
"We're leaving the system, returning to Earth."
It was obvious why. The aliens' act of aggression had made it clear there would be no meetings, no discussion of their activities on Earth, no attempt to come to a resolution. Humans were not welcome on their patch. "Any signs of their ships?" she asked.
"Nothing yet. The scanners couldn't even detect the ships that attacked the shuttle. The data say there's nothing in the direction where the pulse bolts originated. On the Dauntless—" "Wait." He seemed to register her rifle. "You're going to help?"
"Of course. Where do I go?"
"Thanks. I was hoping you would. That thing about putting you and the kids first—"
"It doesn't mean I don't fight. Just, if it comes down to it, please do all you can to save Patrin and Kayla, even if it means neglecting your duties."
Okay, it's a deal. Stick with me. We're going to airlock A."
They set off at a run.
"When the aliens attacked the Dauntless—"
"Arthur told me, a horde of Merlins and Morgans."
"It was surreal, but Iolani figured out a way to defeat them. We can do it again if they pull the same trick."
Taylan doubted they would. If their tactic didn't succeed last time, why would they try it again? Let's hope the attack on the shuttle was a shot across the bows and they'll leave us alone when they see we're leaving.
"I hope so too."
The alternative didn't bear contemplating. Pulse bolts from an invisible ship? And it had to be a particle beam that had cut off the shuttle's tail section. The Defiant carried the latest weaponry, but it was useless if they had nothing to aim at. By the time she and Wright reached the airlock, 20 or so Marines were already waiting for his arrival. Arthur was here too. He'd brought Excalibur and he'd taken off his helmet. When Wright challenged him about it, he replied,
"I do not like to wear it, and I had no need of it last time, my friend. What makes you think I'll need it now?" "Your sword was useless last time too,"
Wright countered.
"Maybe you would be better off with a rifle. If Merlin allows me to fight, he will, regardless of my weapon. The decision is in his hands."
"What's that about?" Taylan asked Wright. "Does it mean I shouldn't look forward to Arthur slicing off Merlin's head?"
"Oh, he'll do it. It just won't have any effect. Get ready. You're at the rear."
"But—"
"That's an order."
She clenched her jaw. "Yes, sir." She stood next to the Marine farthest from the airlock. Despite the inertia dampeners, the acceleration force of the Defiant's rapid departure dragged at her. She activated the magnetic soles of her boots. Wright hated including Taylan in the fight, but he had no choice. They needed her. Rejecting the support of a skilled fighter in this situation was madness, even if she was his wife. "Sit, Rep, Lieutenant Colonel." Colburn must have made it to the bridge.
"In position at airlock A, Brigadier."
"And the rest of the airlocks?"
"All covered."
As before on the Dauntless, he was responsible for repelling boarders.
"Any sign of anything, Brigadier?"
"Not a thing. We didn't see it, but the Defiant was firing in defense of the shuttle. Unfortunately, our computer can't extrapolate the coordinates of the hostile ship fast enough to hit her when firing back. I'll keep you posted." She cut the comm. Wright tensed, waiting for the judder of the alien ship securing a hold on theirs. But nothing happened. Seconds turned into minutes. He forced himself to breathe and ease his racing pulse. Things had been bad on the Dauntless, but at least Taylan and her kids had been safe on Earth. He regretted persuading her to join the mission. Would she forgive him? He hoped she had the chance. Arthur stood still as a statue, Excalibur balanced in 2 hands, and the Marines were ready. Surely if the aliens were going to attack, they would have done so by now. Their ship had been right there in the vicinity. All she had to do was turn her firepower on the Defiant. There was no way the enemy feared a reprisal. It had everything on its side. Perhaps they were going to let the humans go. Wright checked his HUD. 11 minutes had passed since Colburn's comm. They would be nearing the edge of the planetary system. How long would Yorkson wait before giving the all clear? If only they could get away, albeit with their fingers burned. The return journey would be more joyful than boring, and when they got home, they could tackle the aliens' interference there. He tensed. Something had changed. He could not say what. Perhaps there had been a tiny check in the ship's movement or an alteration in its electrical field, but something had happened. "We're under attack," came Colburn's comm. "Pulse cannon, at the ready, Wright." He relayed the alert to his team and the teams at every airlock. There was nothing to do now but wait. Either the aliens would try to board, possibly after disabling the Defiant, or they wouldn't. If their intention was to destroy the humans' ship, there wasn't anything he could do about it. The work was down to Yorkson and the weapons officers on the bridge. Taylan hailed him in a 1-to-1 comm.
"Yes,"
he answered, his tone automatically softening. I
love you too."
He couldn't imagine what she was going through. The thought of losing her was agony, but she was contemplating the deaths of her children, a torment she'd already suffered once in her life. And here he was, putting her through it again. He contemplated apologizing, but how would that help?
"Taylan, if you want to be with Patrin and Kayla."
"No, I'll stay here for now, until I know for sure there's no hope."
"TJ?"
Arthur asked.
"What's happening?"
Without his helmet, he wouldn't have heard the message that they had been fired upon. Wright switched to external comm and explained. He added,
"I really wish you would wear your helmet."
Arthur only smiled. The ship swerved heavily, forcing everyone over to the side. Only the magnetic hold of their boots on the deck kept them standing. Had it been an evasive mover or the effect of a second hit? Not knowing what was going on was frustrating. The Defiant swerved again, and a tingle passed through Wright the like of which he'd never felt before. "What was that?" Taylan asked.
"No,
"Hull breach, deck 2, Colburn announced. That was the deck directly above. Wright asked,
"Do you want me to do anything, Brigadier?"
"Not yet. A breach repair team has been dispatched." Shit. He chose to not relay the news to his men and women. There was nothing they could do about it anyway, and he needed them to focus. Things were going the way they had on the shuttle. That had been breached before the tail section had been sliced off. The atmosphere readings on his HUD altered. The breach had to be a big one, unless it had... He looked up and around. A klaxon screamed out. There it is. A crack had appeared on the bulkhead. Microseconds later it had run to the overhead.
"Ma'am, the breach has spread to deck 1.
We're on it, right? Another team is on its way. Maintain your position." The same tingle he'd felt a moment ago coursed through his body again. Another hit. The aliens were not playing with them this time. They were set on destroying the ship. "Hull breach deck 4. The passenger cabins were on deck 3. Too late, Wright realised there was now no access to it with 2 breached. He glanced over his shoulder. Taylan was standing with the rear guard, her body armour and rifle identical to everyone else's, yet to him she was unmistakable. He couldn't see her face through her darkened visor, but he felt her gaze meet his.
"If you want to."
"I know," she choked. "I'm talking to them now." The crack in the hull was widening. Decompression started up. Arthur raised his hand as if feeling for wind direction. He seemed to struggle to breathe. The Defiant would auto-repair but not fast enough, and there was no sign of the team Colburn had promised.
"Arthur, put on your helmet."
The king steadfastly shook his head.
"Is this it, TJ?"
The tingle hit Wright's body for a 3rd time.
"I think it might be."
Arthur appeared confused.
"I did not think it would end like this. I should have died thousands of years ago. I do not mourn my ending, but it is wrong of Merlin to kill all of you as well."
The fissure in the bulkhead had spread. Wright could have pushed fingers into it. On the outer hull it was probably already centimetres wide. A breach team wouldn't arrive now. The section would have been sealed. He ordered everyone to retreat to the farthest ends of the passageway and hold on to anything they could find. They were done for, but dying from asphyxiation was preferable to being pulled through a narrow gap. Wright found Taylan. They stood with the Marines, pressed against the sealed doors, hand in hand. A dropped weapon lazily rose to mid-air before being drawn to the breach. The Defiant had lost gravity. She was breaking up. Arthur had not moved. His legs outspread, he lifted Excalibur in one hand, his beard a mane of silver hair whipped by the gale of escaping gases. He grimaced, and his chest heaved as he struggled to breathe. Then he spoke, and Wright only just made out his words in the thinning air.
"Merlin, my old friend, do not wreak your vengeance on my countrymen. They have done no wrong, only sought to protect their lands and loved ones, as you helped me to do long ago. If someone must die, let it be me. Allow the others to go free."
His plea drew no reaction. The tear in the hull continued to widen, the depressurization rush nearly pulling Arthur off his feet.
"Merlin!"
the king screamed.
"You saw something in me once, something you thought worth preserving for thousands of years. All my life we were friends and companions. If that meant anything to you, if I meant anything to you, I beg you, do not do this. Let my people live."
With a resounding crack, the breach tore open. A jumble of bodies hurtled toward it, Wright's among them. Taylan's hand was ripped from his grasp. He'd lost her. His visor smashed into someone's helmet and fractured. His suit alarm went off. A sharp hiss signalled escaping internal atmosphere. Where was Taylan? He was whirling, propelled into the void. He saw body armour, a rifle, a glimpse of Arthur, blackness, stars. He was fading. Where was Taylan? He could see her now. She was walking toward him, wearing an ivory gown that swept the floor. It was like the dress Guinevere's ghost had worn on the Dauntless. She was holding a bouquet of wild daffodils, and she had flowers in her hair. Kayla walked behind her, holding her train, and people sat in rows on each side, watching as she passed. She smiled at him. His vision blurred. She was gone. Chapter 34. The first sensation to hit Taylan was weight. One moment she was spinning into the vacuum, forever torn from her kids and right, and the next she was inexplicably weighed down. Another heavy weight rested in her hand. She blinked. Her view was narrow and oblong, as if she were looking through a slit. She could see colourful shapes against a green background. She tilted her head back. Above, the sky was blue, and puffs of white cloud rode the air currents. She could smell grass and something else, something earthy and sweaty. A jangling sound came from one side. When she turned her head toward it, the shapes and greenness were replaced by... She squinted. Was that a horse? She must be unconscious. She must have hit her head while being sucked through the hull breach. Or maybe this was some kind of dream as she was dying, her oxygen-deprived brain conjuring images from her past. She waited. Would she wake up, or would the dream fade to blackness? She wished she'd been able to see Patrin and Kayla one more time. The dream continued. In the absence of anything else to do, she decided she would go with it. She brought her free hand up to her face to find out what was blocking her vision. Her fingers met metal, and more than that, they felt as though they were covered in metal too. She opened and closed a fist experimentally. A soft clinking sound reached her ears, as if pieces of metal were rubbing together. What was she holding in her other hand? She angled the slit in front of her eyes downward and lifted her encumbered arm. She was so surprised at what she saw, her hand opened reflexively and she dropped the sword. The soft thud as it hit the ground told her she was standing on turf. Everything began to add up. Horse, sword, metal glove, green field, the feeling of being weighed down. Leaving the sword where it was, she gingerly touched the covering on her face again and pushed it up. Her visor opened, and finally she could see. Holy fuck! This wasn't confusion after a head trauma, and she wasn't dying. This was a hallucinogenic nightmare. Someone had slipped her some bad shit. A green field ran from her feet to hills on the horizon, dotted with pavilions and tents in many colours. She stood among a group of knights in full armour. The ones who had also figured out how to open their visors looked as shocked and confused as she imagined she did. The horse she'd seen was one of several standing to her right, shifting from hoof to hoof. The jangling she'd heard had been the bells on their bridles. Her pulse thumping in her ears, she tried to make sense of what she could see. She scanned the surroundings and realized they looked familiar. She was back on the alien planet. The topography was the same, only it had been transformed to a scene from Where Was Arthur? Even more importantly, where were Patrin and Kayla, and where was Wright? A knight fumbling with his visor caught her attention. Even clad in mail, he looked familiar. After picking up her sword, she stepped over to him and lifted the metal covering from his face. Taylan? Wright's expression of utter shock and surprise was almost comical as he took in the scene. Then he grabbed her in a rib-cracking hug. Finally, he said, "What the hell's going on?" "Your guess is as good as mine. I'm just glad we aren't dead, or don't seem to be. I'm going to see if I can find the kids." "I'll help you." They were not too hard to spot in the end. A hulking knight in armour stood next to a maiden in a simple gown, her hair under a wimple. Taylan had never been so relieved to see her children, except possibly that time she'd found them in the outback. "Ma'am?" Kayla asked, peering at her. "Is that you?" "Of course it is," Patrin answered. "Can't you tell?" "I've never seen her dressed as a Knight of the Round Table before," Kayla retorted. "Is that what's going on? Have we gone back to Earth and Arthur's time?" Patrin rolled his eyes. "How could that be true?
We haven't been travelling through space for months.
Well, if you're so clever, how do you explain this? Kayla spread her arms wide.
Where Merlin and Morgan are concerned, anything's possible, said Taylan. But I recognise this place, don't you? Yes, I do, Patron replied, his eyes widening. We're back where we were before, said Wright. The aliens must have decided not to kill us just yet. This is some sick fantasy they've put us in. They want to play with us a bit. Taylan, I need to find Colburn and Yorkson and speak to the Marines to put their minds at ease.
Good luck with that. I'll try to find Arthur and talk with the others. Once she looked for him, the king was easy to spot. He'd taken off his helmet and his hair and beard cascaded over his armour. He was walking away from her. Telling Patron and Kayla not to move a muscle, she ran after him. When she caught up to him, however, he didn't stop. Arthur, wait a minute. She touched his arm. He brushed her off like a fly. Arthur! He seemed transfixed by something. Following his line of sight, she saw a horse, a monster of a horse. At its shoulder, the bay stallion stood not much shorter than Arthur's height. The animal wore mail and the Pendragon arms on its flanks and breast collar. Arthur reached it and gently ran his hand over its cheek and jaw. The horse bowed its head. Arthur breathed into its nostrils, and its hoof gently scraped the ground. Reaching up, he held each side of its lowered head and pressed his forehead into the animal's blaze. He turned to look at Taylan, his eyes wet.
He is my Destria. I know he isn't real, but...
He rested his head on the horse's once more and patted its neck.
Arthur, how nice of you to visit.
Merlin had appeared out of nowhere. Taylan took a step back. Merlin continued,
I thought you might like to see another old friend of yours.
Arthur straightened up, taking hold of his horse's reins. Tiny silver bells on the bridle jingled.
Thank you for bringing him to me, and for not killing my friends.
Your thanks may be premature, Merlin replied, a twinkle in his eye.
As you can see, they all remain a long way from home and safety.
Merlin, Taylan said, taking a step forward. This game of yours has gone on long enough. Let us go home. Leave us alone. We aren't toys for you to play with. What you and your species does is disgusting.
Ah, yes, Lancelot's descendant. And I believe another generation of your family is here too.
Taylan felt the colour drain from her face. He knew about Patron and Kayla. But of course he did. He could probably see the connections running from her to her children like bees saw ultraviolet. She was blind in comparison. The alien snickered.
What possible reason could I and my fellow players have for allowing you to leave and giving up our game?
So you can do what's decent and right.
These are human concepts, interesting, but without value among my kind.
Taylan bit her lip. There had to be something that would appeal to him, something he would agree to in order to let them go free. You could have killed us all a short while ago, but you didn't. Whatever it was that changed your minds then, the same reasoning applies now. Let us go. Please don't kill my children.
I'm afraid you are wrong, Merlin replied. That reasoning is why you're here. If we wished, we could return all of you to your little backward planet in your equivalent of an instant. We will not be doing that. You dared to invade our system, to try to look in the eyes of your gods. For that, you all deserve to die. Arthur appealed to my sense of comradeship with him, and I decided to grant a stay of execution. That's all. Perhaps there is still some entertainment to be had from you. The expressions on your faces when you found yourselves thrust back several thousand years has already fulfilled that criterion somewhat.
Taylan stared at him. How cruel and depraved could his species be? Arguments whirled around her mind, but she couldn't hit on anything that might sway him. There was no point in asking for mercy, no point in telling him of Seren's pregnancy or her own children's youth. There was also nothing she could offer on Earth's behalf in exchange for their lives. Humans had nothing to offer this highly advanced life form except, as Merlin put it, entertainment. Maybe that was it. You've brought us here to fight for our lives, haven't you? That's what all this is about. She lifted the sword in her hand and indicated the field of knights and chargers. Well spotted, the alien replied sarcastically. I'm guessing our opponents will appear in a minute, phantasms of the kind Morgan made of my children, or maybe like the copies of you and her that attacked the Dauntless for fun. Something like that. The corner of his lip lifted. We won't do it. Won't do what? We'll refuse to fight. Taylan, Arthur demurred. Be quiet, she told him. To Merlin she said, what's the point in fighting if we're going to die anyway? We might as well give up now. Literally fall on the swords you've so handily supplied. It'll make a bit of a mess of your nice field, but that's your problem. I'm sure you'll find a way to deal with it. Nonsense, said Merlin. Humans would never give up so easily. That's what makes you so engaging. I'm telling you, she said, if you want a fight worth watching, you need to give us something worth fighting for. The alien raised a finger to his lip. Go on. I'm intrigued. This was it. This was what floated their boats. They loved humanity's fierce grip on life. That was why they incited conflict. They got their kicks watching people fight it out. Maybe their long lives or even immortality had made them jaded, and seeing humans cling to life with every ounce of their being made them feel alive. We will fight if, when we win, you let us go and vow to never interfere in human affairs again. When you win? Merlin asked. Don't you mean if? When? Said Wright, who had suddenly arrived at Taylan's side. We'll win if you give us a fair fight. Those are your rules, aren't they? You make things roughly equal. When you attacked the Dauntless, your ship was a near copy, and you used pulse rifles against us. On Earth, you made two main pieces on each side of the game, Arthur and Carla Orr, impervious to harm. Merlin's eyes narrowed. How astute. Perhaps you are a whole step above other primates after all. Give us a fair chance of winning, Wright pressed, and the rewards Taylan asked for, and we'll do it. Is that right, Taylan? That's right. Those are our conditions. Chapter 35. No one gave you permission to negotiate with these lunatics, Yorkson seethed. Just who do you think you are? The aliens had dressed him in some kind of merchant's or court administrator's costume, probably after correctly concluding he was too old to fight. He looked ridiculous. His floppy hat had fallen over one eye, and his face was red with anger. The Admiral was clearly out of his depth, and it showed. I think Taylan's got us the only break we're going to get, said Wright. The aliens have no regard for human life. We're toys to them. If they get bored, they'll break us and go on their way. If they have so little regard for human life, Yorkson countered, what makes you so sure they'll hold to their word? We could fight their stupid battle, and they could kill us all anyway. We can't be sure, Taylan agreed, but we're dead whatever we do. They nearly killed us on the Defiant. It was only Arthur pleading for our lives that's given us a stay of execution. For all Merlin's cold-heartedness, he seems to feel just a tiny bit of affection for our king and fond memories of their time together. Look around you. He's recreated Arthur's time in perfect detail. If there's the smallest chance we can exploit his feelings of friendship and nostalgia, we should take it. Colburn seemed undecided on the question. The aliens had made her a knight, and she studied her gauntlets thoughtfully, opening and closing her hands. Almost everyone was a knight. All the Marines, the brothers from West BI, Abacha, Captain Ford, and Kevin all wore mail and carried swords. Only a few of the mission members were not knights, and aside from Yorkson they were all women. Iolani, Kakoa and Seren wore long gowns and wimples like Kayla's. The engineer, Kroll, a friend of Wright's from the Resolute, was also in a dress, and she looked furious about it. Taylan didn't know what had happened to Carla Orr and Perrin. They seemed to have disappeared. "Admiral," Colburn said, "unfortunate as it may be, I don't believe we have any choice about it. For better or worse, Ellis has agreed terms with the aliens on our behalf, even though she lacked the authority." She gave Taylan a withering glance. "We can't back out now, especially as we don't have any better ideas." "But a full-on battle in the ancient style?" Yorkson asked, his pitch high. "With swords, horses and—" "This isn't really how it would have been," Taylan interrupted. "There would have been unarmoured infantry too, recruited from the local peasants, and archers." "Well, thank you for the history lesson," Yorkson said icily. "That's a great help. My point is, we have no idea what we are doing. My men and women are not knights, they are Royal Marines." He whipped off his hat and used it to mop his sweaty brow. He continued in a calmer tone, "I have no idea how to command them. I am not familiar with the battle tactics of the olden times. How should the troops be positioned? How should they move over the course of the battle? I simply don't know." Taylan didn't answer. The Admiral's worries were valid, and she didn't know how to help him. She had never studied the battles of ancient times in any detail either. She'd always been more interested in one-to-one combat and the stories of the famous knights.
"As I understand it," said Wright, "it's kind of like a game of chess. You have the king, who the other side tries to capture and kill, knights on horseback, who have more maneuverability than most of the rest of the pieces, foot soldiers."
Taylan grabbed his arm. "Yes, it is like chess. It's also like Shang-Chi." She left to find Abacha. The knights on the alien side seemed just about identical to the Alliance's. Their faces were invisible behind their visors, but the number of them was the same. They had the same amount of horses, too. They'd appeared suddenly and silently on the open field beyond the tents.
"How much longer do we have?"
Abacha asked, looking nervously at the enemy. "I don't know," said Taylan. "Knowing Merlin, he won't give us much notice." Abacha returned his attention to the patch of dirt at his feet, where he'd been scratching maneuvers.
"It's fairly simple anyway. Simpler than Shang-Chi, as we only have 3 types of pieces. The general, soldiers, and horses. No cannon, advisors, or elephants."
"Elephants!" exclaimed Yorkson. "No, thank the stars."
"I suggest our right flank moves first, advancing the horses. How many riders do we have?"
"I'm not sure," Taylan replied. Several Marines had taken charge of horses. She hoped there were enough of them. Abacha said,
"The enemy is likely to mirror our advance. What we do next depends on what they do with their general, if he enters the fight or if he hangs back."
"Their general?" Yorkson asked.
"Their king. Knowing Arthur, our king will fight."
"I wouldn't like to try to stop him," Taylan commented. Arthur had already been up on his destrier practicing swings with Excalibur.
"So he'll be in the thick of it," said Abacha. "Will the enemy try to cut a line straight through to him, or will they go for easier targets first, namely us?"
A painful silence fell. The bizarre situation was most likely everyone's last taste of life. Taylan pushed the thought away. She could accept her own death, but not the deaths of the people she loved. "If their king hangs back, we should try a pincer movement, sending our fastest and best fighters around each side to attack him, while the rest of our troops keep theirs too busy to notice." Abacha smiled.
You did learn something from our Xiangqi games after all.
Will any of you be able to kill him? Asked Yorkson. Wasn't there some talk of Arthur being indestructible? If their king is a mirror image, he'll have the same protection.
I don't think Arthur is indestructible anymore,
Wright replied.
He took a hit at Mars Station. First time I've known it. Merlin may have removed his protection. On the other hand, he didn't have Excalibur with him, so I'm not sure.
Taylan said Excalibur was only ever meant to prevent him from dying from a wound. The invulnerability to pulse fire was a new thing. She sighed. We just don't know. We'll have to hope we can kill their king.
And that Merlin doesn't pull a fast one at the last minute, said Wright. We can't trust him to play fair.
You're right, said Iolani, who had just joined them. She peered at Abacha's scratchings in the dirt. Is this the battle plan?
Just some ideas,
Abacha replied. Can you give us any insights into what we might expect? Taylan asked. Iolani shrugged. I would love to. That's why I came over. But thinking about it, this seems to be more of a military exercise than anything. I do agree with Wright, though. You shouldn't expect the aliens to play by the rules they agreed. That would be expecting them to behave like humans with a modicum of integrity. They aren't human, and they've already shown they see us as little more than animals. You could do everything right, win the battle, and kill or capture their king, and the aliens might still go back on everything you've agreed. Taylan said, That's a chance we'll have to take. Chapter 36. Wright looked up into the blue sky and then out over the green fields to the surrounding hills. The aliens had created a reasonable facsimile of Earth, or were they only projecting the scenery into his mind? It was impossible to tell. Even though it wasn't Earth, it was a good place to die. Better than suffocating to death in an EVA suit in the freezing, lifeless vacuum of space. Merlin's knights began to advance. They walked like automata, their armour glinting in the sunlight. Yorkson would soon give the signal to go out to meet them, but Taylan was still arguing with Patrin, trying to get him to dismount his horse and not participate in the battle. He'd taken a position at Arthur's side among the small contingent of mounted knights. Taylan's anxious, loud tones floated across the field on the wind. There was no way she would get Patrin to agree, and her son was too big and strong to be physically forced. Everyone seemed to know it but her, as they all ignored the argument. The men from West BI stood a little down the line to Wright's left. Captain Ford was farther on, near the end. The other Australian, Kevin, stood with him. Abacha would remain at Yorkson's side to help direct the battle, unless they decided to implement Taylan's suggestion, in which case he would join the fastest runners. Wright could not imagine running in this armour. Maybe he would manage a fast jog. A piercing whistle shrilled through the air. It was time. He began to walk toward the enemy, his feet falling heavy on the soft ground. The line advanced with him. Taylan raced behind the walking knights until she reached his side. Her face was wet and her eyes teary. She joined him, and her jaw set grimly before she lowered her visor. Muttered curses leaked from within her helmet, and then she said, louder, "He wouldn't listen! He's a kid, just a kid! He thinks he's in a fairy tale!"
"You tried," he replied. "What he does is up to him. Where's Kayla?"
"With the women. They found a tent full of bandages, splints and stretchers, and they got the message they're supposed to tend the wounded. The real medics have joined them. Patrin should have stayed with his sister. I need him to protect her."
"I'm not sure that'll help if things go against us."
"Shut up," said Taylan. "Just shut up." Then, barely audibly, "I hate it when you make sense." He cast a glance down the line. Despite the danger and the hopeless situation and the sheer lunacy of it all, his heart filled with awe and admiration. The mounted knights on their mail-coated horses, coats of arms in bright colours adorning their flanks, looked magnificent. A battle standard had been found, and Arthur's dragon floated high and proud. On each side of the mounts, knights in gleaming armour walked steady and unflinching toward their fate. In modern warfare, humans killed at a distance. Pulse rifles, mortars, heavy guns, rockets, laser fire, drone attacks, missiles, bombs, these all killed. But the deaths and injuries were not personal. Rarely did the occasion arise when you had to stick a knife in someone, to feel it go in and see the effect of what you were doing on the victim's face. Killing like that took guts. His own experiences of death close up had scarred him. Arthur's knights had been brave men to go willingly into battle. The distance between the two sides was closing uncomfortably fast. "Keep your shield up and stay close to me," Taylan said, tension edging her voice. "Don't worry, I'm not stupid." Apart from Arthur, she was the best sword fighter they had. The tramp of metal-shod feet was loud, laced with the thuds of horses' hooves. The noise redoubled as the enemy drew nearer. Would they be as easy to kill as ordinary men? More importantly, would they stay dead or dissolve into smoke as the Merlins and Morgans on the Dauntless had, rejuvenating and returning for another go? If that happened, his side was screwed. There was no fire-extinguishing system here. A shout rang out. The mounted knights kicked their steeds to a trot, and the small group broke from the line. The trot quickly became a canter, and then a gallop. The battle standard streamed out. The enemy's cavalry charged out to meet Arthur and his men, leaving their foot soldiers behind. The mounted knights barreled into them with a great clash of arms. The two sides began to hack at each other, their horses rearing and neighing, bringing down their iron shoes on the necks of their foes. "Here we go," said Taylan. The walking knights began to run. A roar ran down the line. Wright found himself roaring too, as he and Taylan lifted their swords and rushed into battle. Coming up against the knight opposite him was like hitting a brick wall. He struggled against the thing's shield, trying to get a hit in with his sword. An agony of confusion followed. Armoured bodies were everywhere, pushing, shoving, clashing. Swords cut through the air, but there was no space to slice or thrust. His helmet took a blow, making his ears ring. There were shouts, yells, screams. He couldn't make out what was being said. He tried to find Taylan, but the narrow view through his visor showed only a wave-tossed sea of mail, shields and helmets. Something thrust into his side, sending pain shooting through his ribs. Another blow clanged against his helmet, setting his ears ringing louder and pain exploding in his head. He swung about and blindly attacked. He was quickly growing tired, weakening with the effort of moving in armour, holding up his shield and lifting the heavy sword. Ages seemed to pass, though it was probably only minutes. Just as he felt he couldn't take any more, suddenly, somehow, he broke free from the throng, amazed to discover empty air surrounding him. He staggered backward, panting, and lifted his visor. Many knights were already down, lying still or groaning, their blood oozing onto the grass. Medics were loading one man onto a stretcher, while Iolani was bravely staying put in the midst of the battle as she tried to staunch another man's wounds. But there were so many wounded, too many for the helpers to attend. Colburn was hurt. Her helmet had come off, and her cropped white hair was stained red. As he darted toward her, a knight ran at him, sword aloft. Wright swept his blade into the thing's visor, delivering a deep dent. It cried out and fell face downward. A riderless horse galloped across his path, and then Wright was on his way again. The clang and clatter of metal on metal, the yells of the fighters, and the cries of the wounded were so loud it was hard to think. He reached the brigadier and sank to his knees. Her skin was chalky white and her eyes closed. Was she already dead? Was that why no one was helping her? If only he could see her status on a HUD. Her eyes fluttered open and then snapped wide as she gawped at something over his shoulder. He ducked. A blade cut through the place his head had been. He dropped to the side, rolled onto his back and thrust his sword upward. He'd had no time to aim, but by chance the tip found the gap below his attacker's helmet and passed straight through it, sinking deep into its head. The sickening feeling of blade piercing flesh came through to Wright's hand. He jerked the sword free and blood gushed out as the knight toppled onto him. It was only a creation of the aliens, yet he felt its death. Heaving off the heavy, lifeless body took all his strength as he bore the weight of its armour as well as his own. "Get back to the fight," Colburn groaned. "I've had it."
"No, I'll get you help."
He scanned the battlefield. There was Kokoa running to Iolani, her arms full of bandages. He shouted her name, got her attention, and then pointed at Colburn. When he'd seen her nod of acknowledgement, he said to the brigadier,
"Someone's on their way. Hold on."
He climbed to his feet. It was time to return to the melee. But who should he fight? In the tussle of armoured bodies, it was hard to tell who was friend and who was foe. A shriek went up, so intense and full of pain. For a second, everything seemed to pause. Then the fighting resumed. The cry had come from the wife of one of the men from West BI. She knelt in the field over a body, her pregnant belly filling out her gown. The cacophony of the battle drowned out her continuing cries of grief and agony. Her mouth screamed in silence while she rocked forward and backward, tearing at her clothes and hair. Time seemed to slow, and the noise of the battle receded. Beyond the knights who fought on foot, the mounted knights continued to hack at and harry each other. Blood ran down their horses' legs and spattered to the ground, now churned mud. Arthur sat tall in the middle, Excalibur flashing. Wright stood mesmerised by the sight, so strange on this alien planet. "There you are!" Taylan's helmet and shield were covered in dents and scratches, but she appeared uninjured. "Come on, we're going for their king. He's over there." She pointed at a lone figure on horseback, slowly leaving the scene of battle. Then she noticed the pregnant woman weeping over her husband's corpse. She froze. "Mark!" Wright touched her shoulder.
"I'm sorry. I know he was your friend."
Something between a gasp and a sob escaped from Taylan. Then she said in a strangled tone, "We have to get their king!" But as she spoke, Arthur broke from the chaos of his fight. Excalibur was in one of his hands, and in the other he carried the pole from which his battle standard flew. His horse cantered to an open patch of grass. He lifted the standard high, and then he dashed it to the ground.
"What's that about?"
asked Wright. "I think Arthur just surrendered." Chapter 37. When the clash of armour and blades had ended, the only sounds were of wounded knights moaning in agony and the wails of the grieving widow. Taylan pulled off her helmet, and suddenly the sounds became louder as the cool air hit her wet skin. Along with the post-battle noise came the scent of blood and death. She was tired, body, heart and soul. Tired of years of fighting the EAC, the long search for her children and the endless conflict with the aliens. Poor Seren. She wiped her blade on the grass and returned it to its scabbard. At least Wright seemed okay. Now the battle was over, he'd also removed his helmet and returned his attention to Colburn, who'd taken a hit. He was kneeling by the brigadier's side. Taylan scanned the field. There was Patrin. He seemed unhurt. He and Arthur were riding toward the tents. And there was Kayla, the hem of her skirt bloody. Taylan winced. The days of her daughter's childhood were over. Wright stood up and said,
"She wants to talk to you."
Colburn wants to talk to me. Why? What could the woman who hated her existence have to say to her?
Please, Wright said, just listen.
She crouched down near the Brigadier's head. She looked like shit. Between the smears of drying blood, her skin was alabaster. Her lips moved, but Taylan couldn't make out any words. She leaned closer, putting her ear to Colburn's mouth. "Might have been wrong about you," she whispered. "Saw your potential. Thought it was wasted. Wright's a good man. Look after him." When the Brigadier said nothing else, Taylan turned to peer at her. Colburn's gaze was fixed and still. She stood up. Wright was looking down at the fallen officer. From the look on his face, she didn't need to tell him anything. "I'm sorry." He nodded, his lips pressed into a line. He cleared his throat and squinted at the horizon. "What now?" "Now we find out what the fuck's going on." Arthur and Patrin had dismounted and were slowly walking their horses off the field. Taylan jogged with Wright to meet them. "Patrin, are you all right?"
"I'm okay, ma'am. Just a few bruises."
"What's happening, Arthur?" she asked. "Why did you give up?" The king regarded her wearily. His surcoat was bloody and slashed, and his horse seemed to struggle to put one foot in front of the other.
"The battle was lost, Taylan. I put a stop to the bloodshed."
"But," she was about to say, "we were going to die anyway," but the words wouldn't leave her lips, not while her son was right in front of her.
"He's right," Patrin said. "It's easier to see what's going on when you're on horseback. Our side was losing by a long way."
"But if we'd killed their king," she said, "it wouldn't have mattered." Arthur replied,
"You could not have killed their king."
"Why not? We could have tried." The hopelessness of the situation hit her, and she protested in anguish, "You should have let us try."
"Ma'am,"
Patrin said angrily,
"you don't know who it was."
"Taylan Ellis," said a smooth voice behind her. Merlin wore armor and a surcoat like Arthur's, except his was not cut or besmirched. He was without his horse, but she immediately recognized him as the mounted figure who had been walking away from the fighting.
"Thank you for the idea of getting you to fight for your freedom," he said. "It's certainly added frisson to your struggle. I hope you didn't mind me taking part in the battle personally, to experience your striving for life at close quarters. Shame it didn't work out for you." "You have to let us try again," said Wright. "That wasn't fair. If the king on your side was indestructible, you didn't play according to your own rules." "How do you know Arthur isn't indestructible too?" Merlin asked. "Because he was hurt by pulse fire on Mars Station. But I could have returned his invulnerability to him. How do you know I didn't?" Merlin's face was a picture of sardonic amusement. He was enjoying himself, playing with them. They would never know whether Arthur could have been killed in the battle unless one of them tried to do it, and of course no one would. "This isn't it!" Taylan exclaimed. "It isn't over yet. There has to be more. Another chance. Give us another chance." Merlin's eyes drank in her desperation thirstily. "My friend." Arthur's tone was soft and pleading. "There has to be another way." There is. Morgan had finally appeared. Walking from one of the tents, she wore the same long dark gown she'd worn on Earth. Carla and Perrin Orr followed in her wake. "Why let everything end now, when we're having so much fun?" she asked. "I see you've brought your brood with you," Merlin said. "How predictable." "Why shouldn't I keep my little ones close? Taylan Ellis understands a mother's love, don't you, dear?" Taylan shuddered. Carla Orr was looking supremely pissed off, no doubt recalling her horrific torture at Morgan's hands, but she had the good sense to keep her mouth shut. Of all the humans, she and her son were most likely to survive in the current circumstances. "That's why you want to prolong this game," said Merlin to Morgan, his lip curling. "You've grown sentimentally attached to your half-breed descendants. Revolting. It should be against the rules to breed with the pieces." "You should try it sometime," said Morgan archly. "It might loosen you up a bit." "I would never." "I agree it's too soon for the fun to be over," she interrupted. "I know what you should do next. A joust. You against Arthur." Her fellow alien opened his mouth to speak, but then shut it again, his expression pensive. He was considering the idea. "I am willing to do it," said Arthur. "It's an excellent suggestion, but if I defeat you, you must allow us to depart." "And leave Earth alone for eternity," Taylan added. "And you have to keep your word," said Wright. "No tricks or last-minute changes of gameplay." Ignoring the human's words, Merlin said to Morgan, "You understand me too well." A look passed between them that nauseated Taylan, and she pulled a face at Wright. Despite the dire situation, he smiled. "Think of it," said Morgan. "It will be like old times, knight against knight, each pitting the best of their skills against the other. Only this time it'll be you in the saddle, something you couldn't do before. You against Arthur, King of the Britons." Merlin looked the king up and down. He surveyed the blood-stained field, where wounded knights continued to receive treatment, while others lay still, beyond help. He turned back to face Morgan. "Agreed." Taylan slumped with relief. They would not die just yet. "I will ready myself," said Arthur. Pulling his horse's bridle, he walked away. Neither Merlin nor Morgan had stated a time for the joust to begin. There was nothing Taylan could do to help Arthur prepare. She knew little about horses, let alone jousting, so she asked Patrin to go with her and Wright to find Kayla. If Arthur failed, at least her family would be together at the end. "All right," Patrin agreed. "Give me a minute." He tied his horse's reins to a tent post. "Was it bad in the battle?" she asked as they walked. Patrin shrugged. "I did okay. I fought like you taught me, and I had no trouble with my horse after Arthur's lessons." Though his tone was light, he had the look of someone who had seen too much, the same look as Wright often wore. A visceral hatred of the aliens who had brought so much pain and untimely death to humans gripped her. She promised herself that if Arthur lost, she would inflict all the damage she could on Merlin and Morgan before they took her out. "No," Wright murmured. He'd halted next to a body. The man had been around Wright's age, maybe a tad younger. His sightless eyes stared skyward. "It's Ford," Wright explained dully. "From the Resolute." Taylan recalled the cheeky Australian who had teased Kevin in the gym. Though it seemed impossible, her heart sank further. Where was Kevin? Had he survived? "Ma'am!" Kayla barreled into her and enveloped her in a tight hug. "I thought you might be dead." "I'm fine," she said, returning her daughter's embrace. "Are you okay?" "It's been horrible, horrible." Kayla's face was tear-streaked and her hands soiled with dirt and blood. "It should be over soon," Taylan said. "Arthur and Merlin are going to joust. Then we can go home." Wright gave her a questioning look, but said nothing. What did he want her to tell her daughter? That if Arthur lost, they were all going to die? Chapter 38. Taylan's friend, Kevin, was alive. That was something Wright was thankful for. The Australian had received a cut to his neck that looked bad, but the medic said it wasn't near major blood vessels and he should survive. How long Kevin and everyone else had to live was another question. Everything hung on Merlin and Arthur's joust, and even if Arthur won, there was no guarantee the aliens would uphold their end of the bargain. They were entirely at their mercy,
but it was the best that could be done. Merlin lifted an arm and drew his hand along the horizontal plane. As if springing from his fingertips, a jousting list appeared, roughly 150 meters long. A wooden barrier hung with brightly decorated cloths separated the two sides, lances protruding from barrels at each end. The rectangular section was enclosed by rope barriers. The battle survivors began to gather. Arthur walked to his horse, heavy-footed and shoulders down, his helmet under his arm. His once lustrous silver hair hung in rat-tails, brown with blood, and the lines of old age cut deep in his face.
"Can he do it?"
Right asked Taylan. She didn't answer. Merlin's gait was sprightly as he strode to his steed and grabbed the reins before climbing easily into the saddle. He kicked the horse sharply. It whinnied and reared, and bright red drops ran from the spots where Merlin's spurs had pierced it. Another kick, and the horse trotted through an opening to the list. Arthur's horse seemed to sink lower when he mounted it, clearly weary from the battle and its master's weight. He slipped his helmet over his head, leaned forward and whispered into the animal's ear, lovingly stroking its neck. Horse and rider walked slowly to the opposite end of the wooden barrier from Merlin.
"He's too old, too tired."
Wright took Taylan's hand and they stepped up to the ropes. Morgan, Carla Orr and her son stood at the opposite side of the list at the centre. Small noises from the audience faded until the only sound was the wind in the grass. Arthur had reached the end of the barrier. He lowered his visor, grasped a lance, and lifted it out of the barrel, balancing the end under his arm. With his other arm, he shifted his shield in front of his body. His horse moved restlessly under him. At the other end of the barrier, Merlin did the same. The two riders waited for the signal. What was it to be? Morgan reached into her sleeve and drew out a handkerchief. Her gaze moving from rider to rider, she lifted it high. Seconds passed. In the audience, all movement ceased. Morgan released the handkerchief. As it fluttered downward on the breeze, both horses were already thundering down the list. The knights' lances bounced and swayed, but kept mainly true, aimed at the approaching rider. "Come on, Arthur," Taylan muttered. "You can do it." Shouts of encouragement came from the onlookers. "Arthur! Arthur! Arthur!" until the chant matched the beat of the horses' hooves, their great strides carrying their masters to their destiny. Arthur leaned forward in his saddle, his shield high as he braced for the impact. His lance was straight as an arrow as he neared Merlin, the long years of practice evident in every part of his being. But Merlin's positioning matched his in every detail. The alien did not need to train to perform this feat. Somehow he'd stolen the skill and made it his own. Taylan's grip on Wright's hand tightened. "Come on!" The lances smashed into the shields. Almost too fast to see, Arthur's lance burst apart, sending splinters flying. Merlin's held, hitting Arthur's shield square on. The force drove him from his saddle. He flew off his horse and landed in the dirt, his armour jangling. The king seemed dazed. At first he didn't move, only lay on his side. Meanwhile, Merlin had circled his horse around and was walking it back to the spot where Arthur lay recovering from his unseating. The king pulled himself into a sitting position and then to his feet.
"Is that it?"
Wright asked.
"Have we lost?"
"I'm not sure," Taylan replied. "I don't think so. Not yet. But whatever happened, it wasn't looking good. Arthur was in bad shape." Merlin pulled on his horse's reins, slowing it to a halt before dismounting.
"What's happening?"
asked Wright. "I think they're going to fight." Merlin kicked the barrier, breaking the wood, until he could step through it. Arthur drew Excalibur, crouched in a fighting position, his shield up, and waited. Taylan said, "It looks like we're going to find out if Arthur's still invulnerable." Wright had a feeling Merlin had withdrawn his protection. The alien was hard to read, but he seemed to be ambivalent about his attachment to the king. He was fond of him, but only in the way an owner is fond of his pet, and even that feeling was fickle. And he also had a malevolent streak that meant he would relish putting Arthur down. Merlin strode confidently the final few paces to his opponent. He circled Arthur, and the king turned in a smaller circle, following him. Merlin lunged. Arthur parried, the clash of swords ringing out over the field. As Merlin's arm swept wide, Arthur moved in, bringing his blade down in an arc. But his opponent lifted his shield in time, so Excalibur thunked into the solid wood. The king tried to wrench his sword free, but it was stuck fast. Merlin dragged him forward and brought his own sword back, clapping the blade into Arthur's helmet. The devastation of the blow was clear. Arthur fell to one side and onto his knees. Merlin tossed his shield away, wrenching Excalibur from Arthur's clasp. The king lifted his shield, but Merlin kicked it to one side and pinned the arm holding it under his boot. Arthur was defenceless. "Stop!" Taylan cried out. "Mercy!" Heedless of her plea, Merlin drove his blade into the king's armpit, where there was a gap in his armour. Arthur screamed. Merlin released his grip on his weapon, and Arthur collapsed, half the sword sticking out of him. The alien turned and lifted his fists in victory. But there were no cheers, only a sullen, stunned silence. Merlin had killed the King of the Britons, the Alliance's champion and the saviour of humankind. Taylan's breathing was ragged. Wright could not believe it either. It was finally over. Carla Orr stepped from Morgan's side, crossed the list and walked through the gap in the barrier. When she reached Arthur, she pushed him with her foot. He groaned. He was still alive, but not for much longer. No one could survive a wound like that. Carla Orr pursed her lips and spat on the dying king. She faced Merlin. "I and my son are only half human. We are of Morgan's blood. You can't treat us the same as these other wretches. We demand life." "You demand?" Merlin asked softly. "We ask. But what will you do? Where will you go? The human's ship is destroyed. We will remain here and live among you. We are your half-kin, after all." Perrin raced across to the broken barrier. "Mother!" "What?" She regarded him haughtily. He was silent. It was certainly a hard choice. Die now or remain trapped on a world populated by aliens and one lunatic parent. "An interesting idea," said Merlin. "Morgan?" His fellow aliens shrugged disinterestedly. "If you like." Her mother's love seemed to be rapidly evaporating. If Merlin agreed, Carla and Perrin's lives would not be pleasant. A quick death would at least be painless. "Very well," Merlin said. "You two may remain, for now." Perrin slumped to the ground, his head in his hands. Carla turned triumphantly to Taylan. "You'll never kill me now, bitch." But Taylan was beyond caring about the former Dweer's petty vengeance. For the first time since Wright had known her, she looked utterly defeated, and he knew it was not because she faced her own death, but because she had brought her children to this place and so sealed their fate. Merlin raised a hand. "As for the rest of you, wait!" a voice shouted. Wright recognized it and scanned for the speaker. While Orr had been negotiating her survival, Patrin had gone under the rope barrier and grabbed the reins of Arthur's horse.
Merlin took a second to realise who he was speaking to. "Ah yes, Lancelot's descendant. How touching you should come to Arthur's aid, but as you can see, it's too late."
The king's chest was barely moving under his armour.
"Fight me," Patrin insisted. "You damned coward! You took on an old man. You stopped keeping Arthur young and vital years ago. He was no match for you, and you knew it. Fight me, or don't you dare!"
"Patrin!" Taylan yelled.
"No!" "Let him have a go," Wright said. "What do we have to lose?"
"You want him to end up like that?" She jabbed a finger at Arthur as he lay dying. Patrin had released the reins. He marched up to Merlin and slammed the hilt of his sword into his shield.
"Fight me, damn it!"
Taylan stepped toward the ropes. "Patrin!" Wright reached out and grabbed her arm. Her son screamed in Merlin's face.
"Fight me, you cut!"
Taylan whirled around and slammed her fist into Wright's jaw. He dropped like a stone onto his butt, stars swimming in his vision. As he struggled to hold on to consciousness, he heard Merlin say, his tone full of menace,
"If you insist."
Wright rubbed his jaw and blinked. He was seeing clearly again. Medics were removing Arthur on a stretcher, and Patrin was walking the king's horse to the far end of the barrier. Merlin was also preparing to joust again. Taylan looked down at him sorrowfully. "I'm sorry for hitting you, but Patrin's going to get himself killed." She held out her hand. He took it and stood up.
"I'm not sure what difference it makes now."
"Maybe none, but I can't bear to watch him die."
"It might not come to that."
"What do you mean? He doesn't stand a chance." Wright hadn't meant that Patrin might win, rather that if he wasn't killed instantly, he wouldn't be forced to linger. Merlin's patience had grown thin, and he would put an end to all of them quickly once the fight was over. "I don't know where he learned that word," Taylan muttered. "It wasn't from me." He had more than a strong feeling it was from her. She suddenly clasped his arm. He flinched. "Don't worry, I wasn't going to hit you again. I just thought of something, but damn!" She rose onto her tiptoes and peered at her son's end of the list. "It's too late to speak to Patrin."
"What?"
Wright asked. She bit her lip and said quietly, "It probably won't work, but it's worth a try." Morgan had retrieved her handkerchief from the ground. She held it aloft again. Though it seemed impossible, the silence and stillness that instantly fell on the field was tenser than it had been before. The cloth dropped from her fingertips, and the riders kicked their steeds into motion. Taylan held out her hands in front of her and watched Merlin like a hawk. Wright had no idea what she was doing, but he hoped to hell it worked. She spared one glance to the left, where Patrin raced down the list, his speed matching Merlin's. Then she devoted all her focus to the alien. His lance was up and steady, bouncing only slightly with the beat of his horse's gallop. His position was solid, his aim true. Unless Patrin was very lucky, the clash would go down as it had before, with him unseated. Then would Patrin beat him in a sword fight? His chances were supposed to be even, but it was clear the alien had hedged everything in his own favour. Merlin was only meters away, his mount's flanks flicking foam at every stride. In the last seconds, before lance met shield, Taylan smacked her cupped hands together, clapping loudly and yelling. Patrin did not waver a millimetre, but Merlin's head turned toward the sound. His shield dropped a fraction, and so did his lance. As its point hit Patrin's shield, it glanced off harmlessly, but Patrin's lance slipped into the gap above Merlin's. It pierced the alien's throat. Impaled on his attacker's weapon, he was lifted from his horse, which galloped on without him. Perhaps in shock, Patrin didn't drop his lance at first, but rode on several meters, Merlin dangling from it. Then he appeared to come to his senses. The weapon slipped from his grasp and the alien tumbled to the ground. The audience stared in horror and amazement. Merlin appeared to still be alive. His hands clutched wildly at the implement in his throat and attempted to pull it out, though without success. The wooden spear was firmly embedded and protruding from the back of his neck. Merlin gagged and choked, his legs feebly twitching. Morgan tittered. Giving up his attempt to extract the lance, Merlin dissolved. His body and armour became fluid and oozed from around it, the colours and shapes mixing. Then the puddle slid to one side and quickly reformed to solidity. The alien stood up and shook himself like a wet dog. While all this had been going on, Patrin trotted back on Arthur's horse. Peering down from his lofty height, he said, "Don't make me fight you. I won that fair and square." "Hardly fair," Merlin said bitterly, his angry gaze turning to Taylan. "I thought fairness and decency didn't matter to your species," she retorted. "Anyway, you did the same to me once. I thought I'd return the favour." Morgan had walked out into the list once more. "I think it was all very amusing. A wonderful few moments' entertainment, don't you think?" She was addressing Merlin. He scowled, but then he said grudgingly, "I suppose so. I have an idea. We could let them go and stop playing our game on Earth if we receive something in return." "No!" Taylan exclaimed. "We won! Patrin beat you!" "That is correct," Yorkson said. He'd run over to join in the discussion and was out of breath. "We won the wager. You have to fulfill your end of the bargain." "We don't have to do anything at all," Morgan sneered. "I suggest you be quiet if you wish to live." Yorkson's mouth snapped shut. Merlin said, "The original agreement was about the battle. You lost. The rest was just for fun." "We lost because you cheated," Wright said. "You powered up the opposition. We didn't stand a chance." "Prove it," said Merlin. "Stop bickering," Morgan complained. "It's very boring. I admit my estimation of your species has risen a little over the course of these events. Perhaps it would be better for us to leave you alone and allow you to develop unhindered by our games. In several 100,000 of your years, humans may rise to a level worthy of our acquaintance. My proposition is this. 2 of you remain here, so we may study human thoughts and behaviour in depth. The rest of you can go back." "That's easy," Taylan said. "Carla and her son have already said they want to stay. And, to be honest, we'll be glad to be rid of them." Perrin interjected, "But I didn't—" "Exactly," Carla said. "If the opportunity to return to Earth exists—" "Be quiet," said Morgan. "You made your choice." Turning to Yorkson, she continued, "We need purebred humans, and I'm not asking you to decide which ones. I've already chosen. We'll take Arthur and the boy. They're clearly the best you have, and we only want the best." "No," Taylan breathed, turning pale. "Not my son. You're not taking my son." "Good choices," Merlin commented. "I'm liking this idea more and more." "There's no need for alarm," said Morgan. "It will only be for a little while." "No," Taylan repeated firmly. "Not for all humanity. He won't stay here. I'm taking him home." While the conversation had been going on, Patrin had dismounted and walked back. He'd been watching and listening silently. "Ma'am, I'll—" "Mark!" a voice screamed. The pregnant woman who had been grieving her husband's death in the battle raced across the field to where a man was emerging from a tent. It was him. The dead man had come back to life. She raced into his arms and clung to him. Her cries of joy could be heard even at the distance. "You could have them all back," said Merlin dismissively.
Arthur's already better. I'll bring the rest of them back to life in return for the boy."
"No!" Taylan's tone was desperate. She looked at Wright, her eyes pleading. "How could you do this?" screamed Perrin, glaring at his mother. "You've ruined my life from the day I was born, and now I'll be stuck here with you forever."
"How dare you?" Carla retorted. "I've only ever tried to do my best for you, you ungrateful brat."
"Your best?" Perrin lifted an arm and spun in a circle. "This is your best? We're in hell, and it's all your fault." He launched himself at Carla and fastened his hands around her neck. Morgan and Merlin looked on, amused. No one seemed particularly motivated to intervene. But then Malia strode over to the struggling pair and punched Perrin's head. The force of his metal-clad knuckles knocked the boy out. As he sprawled unconscious on the grass, Carla stepped carefully away from her son, rubbing her throat. She looked appealingly at the crowd, but attention had returned to the aliens and their demand.
"Ma'am,"
said Patrin, laying a gentle hand on Taylan's arm.
"It's all right. I'll stay. I don't mind. I'm interested in this place, and they said it's only for a little while."
"You don't understand," she protested. "A short time to them is thousands of years to us. We'll never see each other again. It'll be like you died. You can't do this. I won't let you."
"Not at all," said Morgan. "We understand how fleeting your lives are, and I know all about maternal feelings. I would not do that to you, my dear."
Taylan looked daggers at her.
"You don't know the first thing about being a mother, you evil witch. Stay out of my life."
Morgan's lip lifted in a sneer.
"The boy, and you can all go home with a guarantee we won't bother humans again."
Patrin said,
"It seems a small price to pay to get everyone who died brought back to life."
Taylan buried her head in Wright's chest as sobs racked her. "I can't do it. Don't let them make me do it." He held her close, not knowing what to say. Chapter 39. Elec faced the crowd as it surged like a stormy sea. He raised his hands over his head, and quiet began to spread. "Shh!" voices whispered. "He's going to speak." When only a minimal buzz of chatter remained, he said into the mic,
"Thank you for coming here today. I hope every person among you finds something they can take from what I say. First, let me be clear. I don't have any great truths to reveal, and I'm not here to tell you what you should do with your lives. I don't have all the answers, and I've never claimed to. That's because the answer is different for everyone. It lies inside you, and it's up to you to find it. All I can do today is maybe give you some clues to help you on your way." It was his standard patter. He'd said the same thing so many times over so many years, he could think about something entirely different while the words fell from his mouth. He was becoming jaded, beginning to feel bored and frustrated with what he was doing, bored and frustrated with himself. It seemed the more he told people they needed to figure things out for themselves and that they controlled their lives and destinies, the more they clung to him. If the behavior of his most faithful disciples was anything to go by, his followers were becoming less and less self-determining by the minute, no matter what he told them. Or was it because of what he told them? He avoided digital communication of all kinds, so he was spared the overflowing inbox and endless messages, but people would come up to him after events like these and ask him for advice on the most inane, ridiculous matters. A young woman had cornered him just a minute ago backstage. "I feel like having a pet would make me happier," she had said. "What do you think, Elec? Would having a pet help me fulfill my inner spirit?" The pointlessness of what he was attempting and the potential damage he might be causing to people's lives had begun to eat at him, yet he couldn't seem to stop.
There was something about what he did, the rush of having the attention of thousands of people, and the knowledge that he exerted so much power over them was a heady, intoxicating mix. It was hard to resist. At one point, when he'd begun to question himself and his motivations, Arieff had spurred him on and refused to let him quit. That had been a few years ago. Now he didn't think he could give up anyway. He was in too deep. "Consider a newborn baby," he said. "Is it a blank slate? No. Scientists have told us that a new human being is genetically determined in many factors of its life. It has its own little personality just waiting to emerge. It's already its own person. Do we have many parents here tonight?" About a fifth of the audience's hands shot up. "You have the most important job in the world. It's your duty to help your little people grow, to nurture what makes them truly themselves. But the journey doesn't stop there." And so on. Blah, blah, blah. A disturbance started up near the front of the audience. While one part of his brain worked his mouth, another watched the churning among the jammed-in people. Someone was forcing a path through the throng, pushing his way toward the stage. Elec glanced at the wings. They were empty. Arieff was not here. Where the hell had he gone? He'd never missed a show before. Elec's gaze pierced the darkness off stage. Another familiar figure was also absent. Where was Setia? Shouts of protest arose as the hooded figure drew nearer the foot of the stage. A security operative moved from the side of the crowd to intercept him. Elec vaguely remembered Setia giving him a hug last night. She hadn't hugged him in years. What had that been about? Had she been saying goodbye? The major news of the day flashed into his mind. Talman's colonists had begun boarding their ships. Setia had said something about applying to the project months ago. Had she gone ahead and done it? Was she leaving on a colony ship? The security officer had reached the threatening man in the audience and was in a tussle with him. A collective gasp sounded as the officer slid down, disappearing despite the packed bodies. The man was at the stage. His hands clasped the edge and he hauled himself up. Fear paralyzed Elec. He couldn't move, only stare in horror. The man was carrying a knife, its blade glistening with fresh blood and an odd metallic glow. Was it flow metal? Was that how he'd sneaked the weapon in? In a great effort of will, Elec yelled and raised his arms protectively, backing away. Everything was happening too fast. "Setia!" Where was she? Why wasn't she here to protect him? The blade flashed down. Epilogue. An old woman was looking out at Taylan from her mirror. Could it really be her? She felt the same inside as she'd always done, but her body had aged. She hadn't given permission for this to happen. Picking up her brush, she sighed. Oh well, it was best to make the most of the time she had left. She brushed her hair. It was white now, like Arthur's had been the last time she'd seen him. That had been decades ago, and very, very far away, on a distant planet circling a strange sun. So long ago it all felt like a dream. When she thought back, she found it hard to believe she had once worn a suit of armor and fought on a battlefield like the knights of old. It had been as if she'd stepped into a legend, a mythological time that no one was certain had ever really existed. Things had moved on. When historians studied the events of the war with the Crusaders, they cast doubt on Arthur's existence. The vids, images and recordings of the king could have been faked, they said, and even if he had been a real person, there was nothing to prove he was the King Arthur. He could have been an actor employed by the Alliance, or he could have been mentally ill. It was rumoured that the BA archives contained medical data and testimony from the time immediately following the discovery of his mummified body, but the archives were sealed for security purposes and no date had been set for opening them. She knew he had been real, but she was just an old lady. Whenever she tried to tell anyone her story, they listened politely with a fixed expression that said she must be losing her marbles. What did it all matter now anyway? Her life had been good, all things considered. She had known a great love and a great king. She had seen myth come to life. There weren't many who could say the same. As she gazed vacantly into the mirror's reflection, she saw the door behind her opening. Lunch had arrived a little early today. A different figure from the one she expected walked in, and her brush dropped with a clatter to the dressing table. It can't be! Without even registering what she was doing, she found herself on her feet. In 3 steps, her son was in her arms. "Patrin! Is it really you?" She could hardly breathe. Was she dreaming?
"It's really me, ma'am."
She held him close, unable to speak.
"I've been back a couple of days," he said. "I couldn't find you at first. It took me a while to get used to the human way of doing things, and I didn't even guess you might be living in a home for seniors."
He added,
Ma'am, you're hurting me."
She released him and took his face in her hands. He looked the same as her last sight of him on a jousting field, half a galaxy away and a lifetime ago. Except not quite. His expression was different, his gaze strange. Something inside him had changed. She said, "I'm glad you found me in the end."
"Me too, ma'am, me too. I missed you so much. I've missed you all. Where's TJ? Is he here as well?"
A too familiar ache expanded in her heart. "Wright died 2 years ago."
"No."
Patrin's features fell. "Don't be sad. I try not to be. It was peaceful, and he'd lived a long and happy life. You have nieces and nephews, you know, and grandnieces and nephews."
"Kayla got married? That's great. What about Caris? What's she been doing? Does she still rescue birds?"
"Caris left on one of Talman's ships. She was long gone by the time we got back. I haven't heard from her since." Patrin sat down on Taylan's bed, looking forlorn.
"I didn't mean to be away so long. Time passes differently there."
Taylan sat next to him. "Where's Arthur? Is he back too?"
"He's gone, ma'am. When I decided to come home, he said he wanted to see more of the galaxy, to meet other kinds of life. They'll help him do that."
It was bittersweet news. She would have loved to meet her old friend again, but it felt right that he would be an ambassador for humanity among the stars.
"Arthur said," Patrin went on, "that if Britons ever need him again, he'll return."
"I know he will, sweetheart. Of course he will." The end. This has been The Defiant, Star Legend Book 6, and the final book in the Star Legend series, written and narrated by J.J. Green. Follow Caris and Setia's story in the spin-off series and space colonization adventure Interstellar Fleet, Book 1, Talman Prime. For more J.J. Green books, visit jjgreenauthor.com.